Section 1. The World That Should Not Exist. There is something deeply strange about the universe that Family Guy lives in. Not strange in the way that most animated shows are strange, where you sort of accept the cartoon logic and move on. Strange in a deeper, quieter way. The kind of strange that creeps up on you when you are watching a late-night rerun with the volume low and the lights off, and you start to actually pay attention to what you are seeing rather than just laughing at the jokes. The world of this show operates on a set of rules that nobody ever explains, rules that bend and fold and occasionally seem to vanish entirely, and the longer you stare at it, the more you realize that underneath the gags and the noise and the chaos, there is an entire universe full of questions that were never answered. That is what we are here to explore tonight. Not the history of the show, not the drama behind the scenes, not which seasons are better than others. We are going to sit quietly inside this world and look at the things that do not add up, the mysteries that have been sitting in plain sight across more than 20 seasons, the questions that the writers either forgot to answer or never intended to answer in the first place. And the beautiful thing about mysteries like these is that you do not need resolution to enjoy them. Sometimes a question that just floats there in the dark, soft and unanswered, is more interesting than any solution could ever be. So, settle in. Let whatever you are carrying today lift a little. The lights are low, the night is quiet, and we are going to wander slowly through one of the strangest fictional universes ever put on television. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33, one of the most coveted broadcast slots in American television. That first episode was seen by around 22 million people, which is an enormous number even by the standards of that era. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and spent time working on animated series at the Hanna-Barbera Studios, contributing to shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. Before Family Guy ever existed, MacFarlane had made two short animated films called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, featuring a regular guy and his talking dog. Those two characters would eventually evolve into Peter and Brian Griffin, the anchor relationship at the center of everything we are about to discuss tonight. The show is set in a fictional Rhode Island town called Quahog. A quahog, in case you did not know, is a hard-shell clam native to the New England coast, and it is the official state shellfish of Rhode Island. MacFarlane grew up in Connecticut and attended school in Providence, so the Rhode Island setting was personal and grounded in real experience. He has confirmed in interviews and DVD commentaries that the town is modeled primarily after Cranston, Rhode Island, though the show pulls details and atmosphere from Providence, Warwick, Newport, Pawtucket, and a handful of other locations scattered across the smallest state in America. The actual Providence skyline appears in the background of many episodes, specifically 3 recognizable buildings: 1 Financial Plaza, 50 Kennedy Plaza, and the old Industrial National Bank building, a 1,927 structure that the city knows well. You can see them from the Griffin backyard in dozens of episodes if you are paying attention and looking past the action in the foreground. But here is where the first mystery begins to unfold. Nobody agrees, not even the show itself, on where exactly Quahog is supposed to be. The show has placed it in at least 4 different locations depending on the episode, and none of them are consistent with each other or with the logic of the Providence skyline being visible from Peter's backyard. In the episode called E, Peterbus Unum, a map of Rhode Island is shown on screen with Quahog marked in red, and it appears to be in the vicinity of Tiverton, a town on the eastern edge of the state near the Massachusetts border. But Tiverton is more than 17 miles from downtown Providence, and at that distance, the Providence skyline would not be visible from a residential backyard without some kind of extraordinary elevation that the Griffin home clearly does not possess. In the episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, a zoom out at the end places Quahog somewhere between Cranston and Warwick, almost directly north of the Theodore Francis Green Airport, which is Rhode Island's main commercial airport serving the greater Providence area. Other episodes show Quahog having a coastline, which narrows the possibilities to either Cranston or Providence, the only 2 candidate cities that actually have frontage on the water. MacFarlane has said in interviews that the town is modeled after Cranston. Writers on the show have confirmed that they specifically chose Rhode Island because Fox wanted a regionally specific setting, and Rhode Island, being small and relatively obscure on the national stage, felt like a place they could take creative liberties with without getting too many things obviously wrong. A writer on the show named Danny Smith recalled in an interview with the New York Times from 2007 that when they were initially developing the setting, he and MacFarlane recognized immediately that Rhode Island had the right qualities for what they were building. Rhode Island is genuinely strange. It is the smallest state but has its own distinct regional identity. It has a history connected to colonial America, to the textile industry, to organized crime, to Ivy League institutions, to some of the most beautiful coastal scenery in New England. It is a place with a chip on its shoulder and a lot of personality, and it was the right canvas for a show that wanted to be specific without being easily fact-checked. Then there is the zip code. In the Season 7 episode Foxy Lady, the town's zip code is revealed on screen as 00093. This is not a real zip code. Real Rhode Island zip codes begin with 028. The fictional 00093 does not correspond to any location anywhere in the United States postal system. The Griffins live at 31 Spooner Street, an address that Seth MacFarlane named after Spooner Hill Road in Cumberland, Rhode Island, near the boyhood home where he grew up. The real-world address of 31 Spooner Street in Providence does actually exist. It sits immediately west of Roger Williams Park, the large public park in southern Providence that contains the Roger Williams Park Zoo. But the house at that address bears no resemblance to the Griffin home, and the Griffin family clearly does not live there. It is simply a coincidence of street address numbers and a name chosen for personal, sentimental reasons. So the town exists in a kind of permanent geographic fog. It is Rhode Island, but no specific part of it. It has a coastline when the episode needs one and does not when it does not. Its population has been stated on screen in the episode Tom Tucker, The Man and His Dream, as 800 people. 800! That is smaller than most rural villages in America, smaller than many apartment buildings in any major city. And yet the town has an international airport, which in real Rhode Island is located in Warwick. It has an extensive subway and metro system, which Rhode Island does not have at all in real life, at least not at the scale depicted. It has multiple competing television news stations, a professional sports arena, a convention center, a downtown entertainment district, and a civic infrastructure that would not be out of place in a city of 300,000 people. 800 residents cannot support any of this. The infrastructure is there anyway, shifting in and out of existence based on what the episode needs at the moment. This is the first and most foundational mystery of the Family Guy universe. The world does not hold still. It is elastic, responsive, and perfectly willing to rearrange itself to serve whatever the story needs on any given week. And somehow, across more than 26 seasons of television, nobody in the show has ever remarked on this quality. The characters move through a geography that does not behave like geography, through a town that cannot be located and should not have the facilities it has, and they do it as naturally as you might walk from your kitchen to your living room on a quiet evening when the rest of the house is asleep. That quality, that deep and persistent cartographic instability, is the bedrock on which every other mystery we will explore tonight is built. It is what makes the show genuinely strange rather than just conventionally fictional. Most fictional worlds are internally consistent even if they do not correspond to reality. The world of Family Guy is not even internally consistent. It is something weirder than that. It is a world that responds to the logic of comedy rather than the logic of geography or physics or continuity, and the result is a place that has been described by fans and critics alike as feeling more like a shared dream than a shared reality. Before we move deeper into that dream, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is where you are. There is something wonderful about imagining all the different places and all the different hours that are hosting this video at this very moment. And if this kind of slow, atmospheric exploration of things that are genuinely strange and worth sitting with is something you want more of, subscribing is easy and it helps more than you might think. Section 2. The Town That Defies All Maps. Having established that Quahog itself exists in a kind of permanent geographic ambiguity, let us go deeper into the contradictions the town accumulates over the years. Because what makes Quahog genuinely strange is not just that its location shifts. It is that the town seems to operate by a set of rules that the writers invented episode by episode, with no master plan behind them. And the result is a place that functions more like a dream environment than a coherent fictional city. The rules exist, but they are not the rules of urban geography. They are the rules of comedy. Consider the infrastructure more carefully. In most episodes, Quahog feels like a small suburban town. The Griffin house is on a residential street. There are a handful of recurring locations: the Drunken Clam Bar, the Pawtucket Brewery where Peter works, a hospital, a high school, a grocery store, a shopping mall, and a few restaurants and diners. This is the scale of a small New England city, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the local news anchors are minor celebrities, and where the same 10 streets appear in every establishing shot. But then certain episodes expand the town into something much larger and more complex. There are moments where Quahog has subway trains running beneath it, a detail that becomes relevant in chase scenes and adventure episodes. There are episodes set in neighborhoods that seem to have entirely different demographics, architectural styles, and cultural atmospheres from the Spooner Street area. There is a district called Asian Town, which appears in the Season 4 episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do when Peter and Lois go on the run and hide there, and which then essentially vanishes from subsequent episodes as if it had never been built. The show actually grounds this detail in real Rhode Island history in an interesting way. Providence did have Chinatown districts at two different points in its history. One existed on Burrill Street until 1901, when it was destroyed by what historical accounts describe as a mysterious fire. Another existed on Empire Street from the late 1800s until the early 1950s, when urban renewal projects cleared it away. The show's reference to Asian Town, whether intentional or not, echoes a genuine historical reality about the region, which adds an unexpected layer of texture to what seems like a throwaway joke about geography. The mayor of Quahog for most of the show's run was Adam West, voiced by the actor Adam West himself, who played Batman in the original 1960s television series, and spent the last years of his life lending his voice and name to this gloriously strange animated persona. Mayor Adam West is one of the show's most consistently inspired recurring characters, a man who is bewilderingly disconnected from civic reality, casually dangerous in an abstract way, and deeply weird in ways that the show never attempts to explain or justify. He makes decisions that border on the hallucinatory. In one episode, he purchases the town's entire water supply to use as a personal bath. In another, he launches a prolonged, expensive campaign against a rogue stoplight. He keeps getting elected through mechanisms that are never explained. Nobody challenges him for the office. Nobody in the show seems to find it unusual to have him in charge. When the real Adam West passed away in June 2017, the show retired the character with genuine care. Mayor West was given an off-screen death acknowledged in a later episode, and the town was shown mourning him with the particular sadness that small communities feel when an eccentric local fixture is gone. The high school was subsequently renamed from James Woods Regional High School to Adam West Regional High School, a piece of in-universe civic renaming that serves as a tribute from the fictional town to the real person who gave the fictional mayor his voice and name. James Woods, the actor, for whom the original school was named because he was raised in Warwick, Rhode Island, had appeared in the show numerous times but fell out of the show's good graces due to real-world controversies. The founding mythology of Quahog is wonderfully strange and worth sitting with for a few minutes. According to the episode Peter's Progress, the town was founded by a man named Griffin Peterson, an ancestor of Peter Griffin, who had been exiled to the New World from England by King Stuart III. Griffin Peterson apparently won formal control of Quahog from the king himself in a talent competition, which is a civic founding story of almost mythic absurdity. No real Rhode Island municipality can claim to have been won in a talent show from a British king. There is also a parallel founding legend, considered the more official version within the show's own mythology, stating that the town was founded by a man named Miles Musket, described with the specific detail of being called Miles Chatterbox Musket, with the assistance of a magical talking clam. A portrait of Musket hangs inside the Drunken Clam Bar, and behind that portrait, in a later episode, Peter and Lois discover a treasure chest hidden in the wall. The treasure chest contains an expired restaurant coupon for a free meal at an establishment called the Founding Father Restaurant. The grand mystery of Quahog's founding, a mystery that stretches back 3 centuries to the colonial era, resolves to a coupon that outlived its usefulness. This is one of the show's most perfect structural jokes, and it also reveals something important about how the show treats its own mythology. Every thread that seems significant eventually deflates into something mundane or absurd. The founding of the city, which should carry historical weight and civic meaning, is reduced to a bad promotional offer. The zip code is fake. The population is smaller than a shopping mall parking lot would hold on a busy weekend. The geography refuses to commit. And yet the town has been the setting for more than 400 individual episodes of television, accumulating enough internal detail to sustain dedicated fan websites, episode concordances, and actual real-world tourism. A company called the Blackstone Valley Tourism Council in Rhode Island offered a bus tour of real locations that inspired or corresponded to places in Quahog. The fictional town cast such a long shadow that it began to have a presence in the real geography it was always pretending to occupy. The Drunken Clam, the bar where Peter and his circle of friends spend most of their leisure hours, is one of the show's most consistent locations and worth a moment of dedicated attention. The bar appears in nearly every season. It has the same general interior layout most of the time, centered around a bar counter, bar stools, a pool table, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a specific kind of working-class New England watering hole. It serves as the social center of Peter's world in a way that few other locations do, the place where the friendships of the show are maintained and where Peter processes his life through conversation and beer. The real-world inspiration is almost certainly a composite of several Providence area bars, and the show has been inconsistent about where exactly the clam sits in relation to the Griffin House. In some episodes, it is clearly within walking distance. In others, Peter drives there. In still others, the geography between the two locations seems to stretch or contract based on narrative need. The bartender Horace ran the clam for most of the show's early seasons. He was gruff, reliable, and largely unexplored as a character, which made his sudden death in season 11 all the more jarring. He was killed by a foul ball during a baseball game in an episode that treated the loss as both genuinely sad and slightly absurd. His replacement, Jerome, had actually appeared earlier in the show's timeline in a Season 8 storyline where he was revealed to have dated Lois in the past. Jerome has been a more developed character than Horace ever was, with a stronger personality and more screen time given to his perspective. The transition was maintained rather than reversed, which places it in the category of permanent Quahog changes, a shorter list than you might expect. Then there is the Pewterschmidt estate. Lois Griffin's family home, Cherrywood Manor, is explicitly modeled after the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, the famous Vanderbilt mansion that sits above the cliff walk on Bellevue Avenue. The Breakers was built in 1893 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II and remains one of the most spectacular examples of Gilded Age architecture anywhere in America, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is depicted as one of the wealthiest men in New England, and grounding his home in the Vanderbilt aesthetic makes cultural sense. It also creates a specific tension in the Griffin family dynamic. Peter's working-class background and Carter's inherited aristocratic wealth occupy opposite ends of a social spectrum, and their mutual contempt reflects that distance perfectly. The Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery, where Peter works, is another piece of genuine Rhode Island texture embedded in the show's fabric. Pawtucket is a real and historically significant city just north of Providence along the Blackstone River. It is home to what is generally acknowledged as the first successful water-powered textile mill in the United States, the Old Slater Mill built in 1793, which served as the origin point of the American Industrial Revolution. The city has a long blue-collar history, the kind of history that fits perfectly with Peter Griffin as an employee. Peter's job at the brewery is one of the most durable anchors in the show, giving him an employment status that barely explains how the Griffins afford their lifestyle, but provides enough of a framework to sustain the premise of a working-class family navigating working-class life. What makes the town of Quahog genuinely endearing as a mystery is not that it fails to hold together as a coherent urban space. It is that the inconsistencies have a texture to them that feels almost earned, like the imprecision of a dream in which you are in a place you recognize but cannot name precisely. When you watch an episode of Family Guy and feel like you understand where you are, that you are in the neighborhood, that you could find the drunken clam from the Griffin house without a map, the show has done its job regardless of whether the geography actually makes sense. The town exists because the feeling of it exists. The feeling is specific enough to anchor a world. And in a show about the things that happen when people share a neighborhood, that feeling, persistent and specific even when the geography is impossible, may be exactly enough. Section 3. Peter Griffin and the Laws of Physics. Peter Griffin should not be alive. That is not a harsh personal judgment about the character's choices or character. It is a straightforward observation about the cumulative number of times he has survived things that would kill or permanently disable any actual human being, and the pattern of those survivals reveals something genuinely strange about what Peter Griffin actually is at a fundamental level. Begin with what we know. Peter Griffin is a middle-aged Irish-American man. He is described in various episodes as being around 44 or 45 years old, though this figure has shifted over the seasons in ways that do not correspond to any consistent aging logic. He is overweight by any reasonable standard, though the show has never specified his exact weight, leaving it as a kind of imprecise enormity. He has poor cardiovascular health, a history of heavy drinking, a diet that tends toward the catastrophic, and no meaningful athletic training of any kind. He works a physical job at a brewery but does not exercise in any organized way. He is, in the most charitable description available, a man who has made choices that compound over time in particular directions. And yet, in the show's early seasons, there is a scene where Brian holds an apple near Peter's stomach, and the apple begins to orbit his midsection, pulled by a gravitational field generated by Peter's own body mass. The joke is played entirely for comedy, obviously. Brian explains calmly that Peter's body has become so massive that it exerts measurable gravitational attraction on nearby objects. For any real object to generate a gravitational field strong enough to pull an apple into orbital motion at a distance of roughly a meter, it would need to contain a mass approaching planetary scale. We are talking about something comparable to the mass of Earth itself. Peter is clearly not that heavy by any visible measure. The show is not suggesting he is. But the scene exists, and it establishes, even if only as a joke, that Peter's body does not entirely obey the laws of physics that govern the world outside the television. This early scene seeds a pattern that runs through the entire show's history with remarkable consistency. Peter's body is simultaneously fragile and indestructible, depending on the requirements of the moment. He has been decapitated and then revived in the same episode. He has been thrown from buildings with enough height to cause fatal impact. He has been hit by vehicles at speeds that should break bones and rupture organs. He has been caught in explosions that destroy the surrounding environment while leaving him charred but functional. He has been drowned, burned, electrocuted, and crushed in ways that catalog the full range of things that kill people, and he comes back from all of them, usually within the same episode and sometimes within the same scene. His healing rate is essentially supernatural when the narrative needs it to be. His pain tolerance oscillates wildly between episodes where he screams dramatically and at length about a minor knee injury, and episodes where he shrugs off what should be catastrophic physical damage without remarking on it. The knee injury sequence deserves its own moment of attention because it became one of the most analyzed pieces of comedy in the show's history. In multiple episodes, Peter bumps or hurts his knee in a minor way, and what follows is an extended sequence of Peter sitting on the ground making a sustained, repetitive noise of pain. The sequence does not end when comedy would normally suggest it should. It keeps going. It stretches past the expected endpoint, into a space where the joke exists purely in duration rather than content. Peter makes the same sound for 30, 40, sometimes 60 seconds. The scene does not develop. The show is doing something subtle here. It is demonstrating that it can stretch time, that it has control over when a sequence ends, and that it will exercise that control even when the exercise makes viewers mildly uncomfortable. It is funny because it keeps going. It keeps going because the show wants to demonstrate that it can. What is Peter's body actually made of? This question, which sounds like an absurd thing to ask about a cartoon character, has been the subject of genuine fan analysis. The most widely accepted framework is something that comic book and animation enthusiasts call Toon Force, a colloquial term for the quality that allows certain cartoon characters to operate outside the physical laws that constrain the rest of their world. Bugs Bunny has Toon Force. Tom and Jerry both have it. Nearly every character in the Tex Avery shorts operates under its influence. The essential quality of Toon Force is that the character exists in a special relationship with narrative reality. They survive things that should kill them, not because of superpowers, but because the story requires them to survive. And in a cartoon universe, the story's requirements override physics. The show has engaged with this idea explicitly on several notable occasions. The episode Inside Family Guy presents the Griffins as characters being performed rather than people living their lives, suggesting that Peter's existence is fundamentally narrative rather than physical. He exists because he is written. He survives because he is written to survive. He regenerates because the next episode requires him to be present and intact. The show has also had Peter directly break the fourth wall and speak to Seth MacFarlane, which further blurs the boundary between Peter as a person and Peter as a fictional construction. In a universe where the character can speak to his creator, the character's physical properties are clearly not governed by physics, but by authorial intention. Peter's full legal name adds another layer of strange detail. Revealed in Season 13, his name is Justin Peter Lowenbrow Griffin Sr. The middle name is a German beer brand. His first name is Justin, which is entirely at odds with how every character in the show addresses him and how he addresses himself. Nobody in 26 seasons has ever called him Justin. It has never come up in conversation. The name exists purely in official documentation, which raises the question of what that documentation looks like. Peter's birth certificate, tax returns, brewery employment records, driver's license, and every other official piece of paper that a middle-aged American man accumulates all say Justin. His wife calls him Peter. His children call him Dad. His friends call him Peter. The only people who know his legal first name are the Rhode Island state government and whoever prepared his birth certificate, and neither party has brought it up. His biological father, revealed in a Season 4 episode, is a man named Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish wanderer with a drinking problem and significant charisma, who had a brief relationship with Peter's mother Thelma before Peter was born. Peter spent his entire childhood believing that his father was Francis Griffin, a stern, devout Catholic man who raised him with a mixture of discipline and disappointment. The revelation that Francis was not his biological father is treated as a significant identity moment for Peter, one of the few genuine character revelations the show has produced that genuinely changed how you understand the man. The drinking, the impulsiveness, the working-class pride, the difficulty with authority, these qualities make more sense against a biological inheritance from a wild Irishman than against an upbringing by a strict Catholic. Thelma Griffin, Peter's mother, was a recurring presence in the show for years. She was tough, slightly checked out emotionally, capable of warmth in measured doses, and carried the particular exhaustion of a woman who had raised difficult children and outlived a difficult marriage. She died of a stroke at the beginning of Season 12 in an episode called Mom's the Word. The episode handled her death with a gentleness that the show does not always manage. Peter grieving his mother feels genuine in a way that the show earns through specific detail rather than generic sentiment. It is one of the more human episodes the show produced in its later years, and it reminds you that underneath the chaos and cruelty and cartoon physics, there is a character who loves the people in his life in his clumsy, imperfect, enormous way. What is Peter, really? He is not quite a human being operating under human rules. He is not quite a cartoon character in the way that purely fantastical cartoon characters are. He exists somewhere between those two things, grounded enough in domestic reality that we believe in his household, his job, his marriage, and his friendships, while simultaneously capable of defying gravity, surviving decapitation, and generating his own gravitational field. He is a mystery dressed as a sitcom dad, and the longer the show runs, the stranger the mystery becomes, because the show keeps adding to it without ever resolving it, without ever saying definitively what kind of creature Peter Griffin is and what laws of the universe actually apply to him. That unresolved quality is one of the things that makes his character so durable as a subject of fascination. We will never fully know what Peter is. We can only keep watching him do things that should not be possible and feel the quiet strangeness of that accumulating episode by episode, like sediment on the floor of an ocean that has no maps. Section 4. Brian Griffin and the question of what he actually is. Brian Edward Griffin is described as a 10-year-old white Labrador retriever. He drives a 2004 Toyota Prius with a license plate that reads BRI D0G and a bumper sticker expressing support for Dennis Kucinich's 2004 presidential campaign. He attended Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, though he never graduated. He served in the Peace Corps. He has had careers as a waiter, a car wash attendant, a pornographic film director, a screenwriter, a substitute teacher at Buddy Cianci Junior High School, a taxi driver, a police sniffer dog, and a novelist whose single published work turned out to be a self-help book rather than the literary novel he had been supposedly writing for years. He has been in romantic relationships with human women, with at least one other dog, and has a biological son from the canine relationship named Dylan Flanagan, who appeared in a cluster of episodes in Season 5 and then largely faded from the show's active attention despite the ongoing fact of his existence. The first and most important question about Brian is the one the show has never definitively answered. Why can he talk? Other animals in the show's universe cannot. Normal dogs bark and pant and chase things. Normal cats behave like cats. When the show depicts random animals in parks, on leashes, in the backgrounds of outdoor scenes, they behave like animals. Brian alone, at least among the dogs we see regularly, speaks with intelligence, reasons through complex situations, forms and maintains long-term relationships, drinks martinis, and holds what appears to be a valid driver's license from the state of Rhode Island. The show has never provided an in-universe explanation for this. Seth MacFarlane has said in interviews that Brian can talk simply because there is something inherently funny about the contrast between a sophisticated intellectual personality and a dog's body, and that the comedy of that premise justified his presence in the show without requiring any further rationale. This non-explanation has generated an extensive community of theories about what Brian actually is, and some of them are genuinely well supported by evidence from within the show itself. The most compelling of these, discussed widely in fan spaces and referenced in entertainment media, is that Brian is a CIA genetic experiment. The theory rests partly on evidence from American Dad, the sister show set in the same universe, which features several talking animal characters who are explicitly identified as the results of CIA experimental programs. Brian's extraordinary and otherwise inexplicable qualities, his full human-level intelligence, his ability to speak, his capacity for complex emotional life, the theory suggests, are the products of the same kind of program. The CIA made him, or modified him, or intervened in his development at some point between his birth on a farm in Austin, Texas, and his eventual life in Rhode Island. Brian's backstory, when you lay it out in sequence, is layered and genuinely affecting. He was born on a farm in Austin in a litter of 5 puppies. His mother was Biscuit. His father was a dog named Coco. When Brian was 3 weeks old, he was separated from his mother. He believed at the time that she had abandoned him, and that early interpretation of the separation, the understanding that he had been left, stayed with him for the rest of his life and became the root of most of his psychological difficulties, his alcoholism, his chronic insecurity, his troubled relationships, his inability to finish the novel he had been working on for years. When he eventually found out what actually happened to his mother, the episode Road to Rhode Island handled the revelation with a kind of dark comedy that felt exactly right. Brian discovers that his mother died and was made into a coffee table. He and Stewie retrieve the table, give Biscuit a proper funeral, and Stewie delivers a eulogy that manages to complement the craftsmanship of the furniture while attempting to honor the dog who was the lumber. After his separation from Biscuit, Brian was adopted by a family called the Hendersons, but he went missing from them while still young. He apparently does not remember the Hendersons at all, until a later episode reveals the existence of a microchip embedded in his body that carries their contact information. The chip is a standard veterinary identifier, the kind that gets scanned at animal shelters to trace a lost animal's ownership history. For Brian, who drives a car and pays taxes and drinks martinis, being identifiable by a subcutaneous chip represents a peculiar collision of his two natures. He is simultaneously a dog who can be scanned like a found animal and a person who has a bank account and a literary career. Brian's origin story within the Griffin family has a continuity problem that is worth noting. The official account, told in the Season 1 episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog, is that Peter found Brian wandering on the street as a stray and brought him home. But in a Season 7 episode called The Man with Two Brians, Brian shows the Griffin family home videos of himself as a puppy, and in those videos he is already living in the Griffin house. The timeline of when Brian joined the family does not reconcile between these two accounts. The show has offered no explanation for the discrepancy. It simply exists, like most continuity gaps in the show, as an unanswered question sitting quietly in the archive of things that were established and then contradicted and never resolved. The question of Brian's romantic and sexual life is perhaps the most genuinely strange aspect of his character, and it requires careful handling because the implications are genuinely uncomfortable if you follow them. He has had long-term romantic relationships with human women, including Gillian Russell, voiced by Drew Barrymore, who became one of the show's more popular supporting characters during her run. He has also had relationships with dogs, including the dog who became the mother of his son Dylan. What makes this strange is that Brian's non-speaking canine partners are described by the show as ordinary dogs, not talking dogs. If Brian has fully human-level consciousness and considers himself more human than dog, as he clearly does, then his relationship with a non-speaking animal of his own species raises questions that the show neither wants to ask nor wants you to think too hard about. It is one of those places where the premise of the character, followed far enough, arrives at something the show clearly cannot address. His death in Season 12 was a genuine cultural event. The episode, Life of Brian, treated Brian's death with a seriousness that the show rarely achieved. He was hit by a car in the street in front of the Griffin home, and the family's response to losing him was emotionally real in a way that felt earned by all the seasons of established relationships. A replacement dog named Vinny was brought in, voiced by the late Tony Sirico of The Sopranos, and the show committed to this change with enough conviction that some viewers believed it might be permanent. Fan reaction was unprecedented. Social media campaigns, news coverage, petitions, think pieces. The death of a fictional animated dog generated the kind of cultural response usually reserved for something that happened to a real person. Then, just 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device to go back and push Brian out of the path of the car. Brian returned. Vinny vanished. Everything reset. The driver of the car that hit Brian was never identified. This is one of the show's most specifically frustrating unanswered questions. We see the car. We do not see the driver. In the weeks between Brian's death and his resurrection, significant fan speculation circulated about who the driver might be and whether the reveal would be important to the story. The resurrection rendered the question moot within the narrative. But the question remains technically open in the show's canon. Someone drove that car. Someone in the Quahog universe ran over the Griffin family's dog and drove away without stopping. That person exists somewhere in the show's universe, and the show has never identified them. What Brian represents, at his most essential level, is a fantasy that many people who love dogs have had at some point. The fantasy of the companion who understands you completely and can tell you so. Most people who have loved a dog have sensed that their animal understood more than it could express, that behind the wagging tail and the patient waiting by the door, there was something that could follow the emotional logic of a situation, even if it could not articulate it. Brian is that fantasy made literal, and the mystery of what he actually is, dog or something else, genuine animal or CIA experiment or narrative convenience, is perhaps best left deliberately unresolved. Some fantasies are more useful as questions than as answers. Section 2 continued. More Quahog contradictions. The question of time in Quahog is itself a puzzle worth spending a moment on. The show premiered in 1999. It has aired for more than 26 years. If the events of the show happened in real time, the children of the Griffin family would now be adults in their late 20s or early 30s. Stewie, the baby, would be approaching 30 years old. The youngest generation of Quahog residents who were teenagers at the start of the show would be solidly middle-aged. But none of this is true within the show's universe. The children remain in school. The adults remain roughly the same ages they were when the show began. The world does not age, or rather it ages selectively. Real events from the outside world intrude, references to current technology and politics appear. The characters can reference things that happened in specific years, without those years changing how old they are. This temporal elasticity is not unique to Family Guy. The Simpsons operates the same way, and so do most long-running animated comedies. But Family Guy has been more aggressive than most in making specific temporal references that create logical impossibilities. When an episode set what appears to be in the present references a specific year as the present, and that year is different from the year of the previous episode that also claimed to be the present, the show is creating a timeline that cannot hold together chronologically. Characters remember things that happened years ago as if those years were a normal distance behind them, even as the present keeps shifting forward to accommodate new cultural references. The result is that Quahog exists in something like eternal present tense. It is always now in Quahog. Now happens to include whatever is currently happening in the real world, whatever television show is popular, whatever political figure is in the news, whatever technological development has just emerged. But it is always the same eternal now, inhabited by people who are always the same age they were when the show began, living in a moment that perpetually refreshes without ever actually advancing. There is something almost meditative about this quality when you lean into it rather than resist it. Quahog is not a place with a past and a future. It is a place with an eternal present, a continuous moment that contains everything that has happened and everything that is happening, and that refuses to commit to any particular location in time. When you watch a Family Guy episode, you are not watching a historical document or a prediction. You are watching a present tense that belongs to Quahog rather than to the calendar. And there is a strange comfort in that, in the consistency of a now that does not require you to keep up with it, that is always exactly where you left it whenever you return. Section 3 continued. More on Peter's physical mysteries. The question of Peter's weight is complicated by one additional detail that the show introduced and then essentially forgot. In an early episode, it is revealed that Peter's belly button contains a small but significant collection of objects. When he cleans it out, he discovers a ColecoVision gaming system inside, along with various other items that should not physically fit inside a navel. The scene is played for comedy and is immediately dropped, but it raises a question about the nature of Peter's body that persists afterward. If objects can be stored inside Peter's body in quantities that exceed the visible exterior, then Peter's body contains more interior space than his exterior suggests. He is, in a limited and absurd way, bigger on the inside than on the outside. This is the same quality that the Griffin house possesses, and it may not be coincidental. In a show where the house and its primary inhabitant share the same impossible spatial logic, the universe may be telling us something about the nature of everything that belongs to Peter Griffin. His relationship with food is another window into his physical impossibilities. Peter eats in quantities that should be medically unsustainable. He has consumed entire animals in single sittings. He has drunk quantities of alcohol that should produce organ failure. His body processes all of this without noticeable metabolic consequence. He is the same basic size from episode to episode despite what the show depicts him consuming. This is, again, standard cartoon logic. Cartoon characters eat without consequences because the consequences would be unfunny and also would require the show to run storylines about chronic illness that nobody wants to watch. But the cumulative effect of Peter's food consumption, his alcohol intake, his physical damage recovery, and his gravitational field, taken together, paints a portrait of a man whose body exists entirely outside the laws that govern other bodies in the show. Even other characters in Family Guy, who are themselves cartoons and benefit from cartoon logic, are not depicted as having the same degree of physical impossibility that Peter possesses. Other characters can die. Other characters sustain injuries that affect them for the duration of an episode. Other characters need to sleep and eat in quantities that are at least plausibly human. Peter alone seems to have no ceiling on what his body can absorb and no floor on what it requires to function. This makes Peter a kind of singularity within an already unusual universe. The world of Family Guy is elastic and impossible, but Peter is the center of that elasticity, the point where the rules are most aggressively suspended. It is as if the universe of the show maintains its impossible qualities by concentrating them in one person, allowing the rest of the world to function more normally by delegating the maximum strangeness to the show's primary protagonist. Section 4 continued. More on Brian's human life. Brian's relationship with alcohol is one of the most specifically developed aspects of his character, and it connects his human qualities to his canine physiology in an interesting way. He drinks martinis. He drinks wine. He drinks beer. He has been depicted as a functional alcoholic for most of the show's run, meaning his drinking is constant and noticeable without, for most of the series, being presented as something that prevents him from functioning. When the show does engage seriously with Brian's drinking problem, as it does in certain episodes, it connects his alcohol use to the early abandonment by his mother and the general psychological instability that has followed him through his life. But here is the biological fact that the show never addresses. Alcohol is toxic to dogs. A standard martini contains enough ethanol to cause serious harm to a dog of Brian's size. Regular consumption at the quantities Brian is depicted consuming would produce organ damage in a real dog in a very short time. The show is aware enough of Brian's dog nature to give him a sense of smell that is useful in drug detection, to have him occasionally chase a ball or bark instinctively, to note that his canine characteristics are real rather than merely aesthetic. But it is selectively aware. When Brian's dogness would create a funny moment or a character-revealing situation, it is invoked. When it would create a problem, as it would with the drinking, it is ignored. This selective awareness is one of the most consistently interesting things about Brian's character. He is a dog when dogness is convenient and a human when humanity is convenient, and the line between those two modes is drawn by comedy rather than by any coherent internal logic. The mystery of what Brian actually is goes deeper than the question of why he can talk. It is the mystery of a character who has been permitted to define himself however the moment requires, and whose essential nature, therefore, remains permanently unresolved regardless of how many episodes the show has spent with him. Brian's literary ambitions are another window into this unresolved nature. He has been working on a novel for years. The novel is never finished. He talks about it constantly. When he does finish something, it turns out to be a self-help book rather than the literary work he had been claiming to be developing. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller is a genuinely painful character study in certain ways. Brian achieves success, but on terms that expose the gap between his self-image as a serious literary writer and his actual output. He takes the success and uses it to become insufferable. He alienates Stewie, who had believed in him. The episode shows that Brian's failure as a writer is not simply a matter of not finishing the book. It is a matter of who he is when success arrives. Not the gracious, authentic artist he imagined himself to be, but something smaller and worse. And yet the book itself, the unfinished literary novel that Brian has been working on for years, remains a live question in the show's universe. It has not been completed and written off. It exists as a thing that Brian is still theoretically working on, a work in progress that has been in progress for the entire run of the show and may still be in progress somewhere in Quahog right now. What is in the manuscript? What is the novel about? Has Brian written any of it at all? Or is the idea of the novel a fiction he has maintained for so long that it has become real to him in some way? The show has never answered this, and the answer, whatever it would be, would tell us more about Brian than almost anything else the show has depicted. Section 5 continued. More on Stewie's weapons. The specific inventory of weapons and devices that Stewie has built over the course of the show is itself worth cataloging, because the breadth and sophistication of that inventory raises the original question about his knowledge in sharper relief. He has built ray guns, time machines, mind control devices, weather manipulation equipment, a particle accelerator, dimensional travel technology, genetic engineering tools, advanced robotics, a working portal gun, explosive devices of various scales, tracking systems, cloaking devices, and a functional submarine. Each of these devices requires not just general scientific intelligence, but specific technical knowledge. Materials, science, electronics, engineering, quantum mechanics, dimensional physics, and a variety of other specialized fields. A child prodigy with access to information and tools might theoretically master some of these in isolated fields. But Stewie has mastered all of them simultaneously, from infancy, without any apparent learning process. He does not appear to study. He does not appear to research. He simply knows things and can build things based on what he knows, at a level of technical sophistication that would require decades of postgraduate work in multiple specialties if a human adult attempted the same outputs. The closest the show has come to addressing this directly is the recurring suggestion that Stewie's intelligence has some source beyond normal human development, whether that source is genetic, cosmic, or something else entirely. The Da Vinci connection, the Big Bang connection, the fact that his half-brother Bertram has similar capabilities and head shape, these details collectively suggest a non-standard origin for Stewie's mind that the show has chosen to leave deliberately obscure. The mystery of how he knows what he knows is perhaps more interesting than any answer could be, because the answer would require committing to a specific theory about what Stewie is, and once you commit to that, the infinite space of possibility collapses into one story rather than all stories simultaneously. What does Stewie want? This question, which seems simple, is actually one of the show's most interesting ongoing puzzles. In the early seasons, the answer was clear. He wanted to kill Lois and take over the world. Those goals were specific, consistent, and generated endless comic situations as Stewie pursued them with elaborate plans and sophisticated technology against a mother who was completely unaware of the danger. As the show developed and Stewie's character softened, his wants became less specific and less clear. He wants friendship, particularly with Brian. He wants to be understood. He wants some version of belonging that his family's dysfunction makes difficult to find. He wants to figure out who he is, a quest that the show has taken seriously in certain episodes but without ever providing a resolution. The later version of Stewie, who explores his identity and his emotional life and his relationship with Brian, is genuinely sympathetic in many of those episodes. But he is also a character who has lost the clarity that made him so distinctive. The early Stewie wanted very specific things for reasons that were specific and strange and entirely his own. The later Stewie wants things that any character in any show might want, which makes him more relatable but less unique. The mystery of what Stewie wants has become the mystery of what any person wants when the particular goals of their early life turn out to be either unachievable or beside the point. Section 6 continued. More on the multiverse's implications. The specific alternate universes that the show has visited, and the rules that govern them, create an interesting taxonomy of causality when you examine them as a group. The Christianity-free universe, where science advanced 1,000 years faster, assumes that religious institutions were the primary constraint on scientific progress during the medieval period. This is a historical argument that real historians debate. The Japan won the war universe assumes that without the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan would have continued fighting and eventually dominated the Pacific. The World War III universe assumes that Frank Sinatra's influence on John F. Kennedy's 1960 election was so significant that without Sinatra, Nixon would have won and triggered a nuclear crisis. Each of these alternate universes is a specific historical argument embedded in a comedy premise, and the show commits to the arguments even while playing them for laughs. This is one of the underappreciated qualities of the multiverse episode. It takes the science fiction premises seriously enough to ground them in real historical causality, rather than simply inventing arbitrary differences for comedic effect. The universes feel like they could have happened, or at least like they have a coherent internal logic that follows from the single divergence point. This gives the episode a kind of intellectual backbone that a pure parody episode might lack. The dog universe raises a specific question about the nature of consciousness and social hierarchy that the show does not pursue but that the episode makes available. If dogs and humans can swap social positions, if either species can be dominant or subordinate depending on the universe, then what determines which position each species occupies in any given reality? The dog universe suggests that the social hierarchy between species is not natural or inevitable, but contingent. It happened to develop one way in our universe and another way in the dog universe, and the difference is not explained by any intrinsic quality of either species, but simply by which way things fell in that particular branch of the timeline. This has implications for how you think about the human-dog relationship in the show's prime universe, and specifically for Brian. Brian exists in a universe where dogs are subordinate to humans. He has internalized enough of that universe's social logic to live as a dog, to accept that his status as a pet is in some ways defining, even while he rejects that status intellectually and emotionally. In the dog universe, the version of Brian who is human occupies the subordinate position instead, kept as a pet by dog Peter. Both versions of Brian are defined by their relationship to the social hierarchy of their respective universes, even though the hierarchy has reversed completely. What never changes is Brian's position at a specific point in whatever hierarchy exists, just below full membership, just outside full belonging, defined by his relationship to those who are fully inside. The multiverse also creates an interesting interpretive lens for the show's most extreme episodes, the ones where things happen that are so far outside the normal register that they feel like they belong to a different show. The Daboom episode, where Y2K destroys civilization and Stewie mutates into a tentacled creature, ends with a reveal that it was all a dream of a character from the television show Dallas. Some fans have suggested this episode should be read as occurring in an alternate timeline rather than the Prime universe. The multiverse framework supports this reading. Not every episode of Family Guy needs to be canon in the Prime universe. Some episodes might be glimpses of alternate timelines, branches where things went differently, viewed from within the show itself without the viewer being told which branch they are in. If this is true, then the full archive of Family Guy episodes is not a single continuous story but an anthology of stories from across the infinite multiverse of Quahog, some from the Prime timeline, some from alternates, with no reliable guide to which is which. The show has never suggested this is the case, but the multiverse framework, once established, makes it possible, and possibility in a universe as elastic as Family Guy's tends to quietly become the truth. Section 7 continued. More on the show's deaths and what they reveal. The treatment of death as a character across multiple episodes reveals something about the show's deepest assumptions that is worth spending time on. In the episode Friends of Peter G., death shows Peter two visions: the future if Peter continues drinking at his current rate, and an alternate future if Peter had never drunk at all. These visions are explicitly framed as what would have happened, real alternate timelines that death can access and project for Peter to witness. Death is not making these up. He is showing Peter genuine alternate realities that exist or would have existed. This means Death, in the Family Guy universe, has access to the multiverse. He can see alternate timelines. He can retrieve them and show them to specific people for specific purposes. This makes him one of the most powerful entities in the show's universe. Significantly more powerful than Stewie's time machine, which can only access timelines by physically moving through them. Death can observe them remotely and apparently instantaneously. The episode never makes this explicit. It treats Death's ability to show Peter his alternate futures as simply what Death does, one of the tools of his trade, like a doctor having access to medical records. But the implication is enormous. The Grim Reaper of Family Guy is not simply the entity who ends lives. He is an observer with perspective across all timelines, able to see what would have happened under different conditions in any individual life. He carries the weight of every alternate Quahog, every version of Peter who made different choices, every parallel life that did not happen in the Prime timeline. And he uses this power to help Peter cut down on his drinking. He shows up at a family dinner and runs a light intervention. This is the show's fundamental comic instinct operating at the highest possible philosophical level. Take the most profound and terrifying possible power, the ability to see all of reality at once, and deploy it in the service of an AA-adjacent self-improvement plot in a half-hour comedy. The contrast is so extreme that it becomes, in its way, genuinely funny, and also, quietly, genuinely moving. Because the vision Death shows Peter of the drinking future is specific enough and sad enough that even in a comedy the stakes feel real for a moment. The characters who have been killed off the show permanently versus those who have not represents an implicit value system about who matters. The characters who stayed dead, Muriel Goldman, Diane Simmons, Horace the bartender, are all supporting characters with meaningful but not central roles. The characters who came back from apparent death, Peter, Stewie, repeatedly, Brian, are the characters whose absence the show cannot survive. This is not a moral judgment about the characters themselves. It is a statement about the show's priorities. Some characters are central enough to the show's identity that the show will reverse anything to keep them. Others are supporting cast, and the show is willing to let the universe claim them. What this reveals is that Family Guy's version of permanence is entirely narrative rather than ethical. Death is not distributed based on any principle of fairness or consequence. It is distributed based on story function. The characters who are necessary for the story to continue are the characters who cannot die. Everyone else is at risk. This is probably true of all television, but Family Guy's willingness to explicitly reverse deaths rather than quietly ignore them makes the system unusually transparent. The show does not pretend that story function and mortality are separate considerations. It demonstrates, repeatedly and without apology, that they are the same consideration. Section 8 continued. More on the chicken fight physics. The spatial logic of the chicken fight sequences deserves extended analysis because it reveals something specific about how the show relates to the physical geography of Quahog that is different from how the rest of the show relates to it. In regular episodes, the geography of Quahog is vague and inconsistent. Locations appear and disappear. The distance between places varies. The map of the town cannot be reconstructed with any confidence. But during chicken fights, the geography becomes unusually specific and continuous. When Peter and Ernie fight their way from the Griffin house to the sewers, to a subway station, to a construction site, to an airplane, the transitions between these locations feel tracked. The fight moves through space with a directional logic that regular Family Guy episodes rarely bother with. The camera follows the combatants through environments that feel like they are actually connected to each other, that exist as part of a coherent urban geography rather than as isolated settings assembled for individual scenes. This is partly a function of the elevated production value given to these sequences, but it is also something more interesting. During chicken fights, the show is temporarily committing to a version of Quahog that behaves like a real place. The geography holds together because the fight requires it to hold together. You cannot choreograph a chase sequence through a city if the city keeps rearranging itself, and the chicken fights have enough of an action movie structure that they need a stable environment to move through. The effect is that each chicken fight creates a temporary pocket of geographic coherence in an otherwise geographically incoherent world. The city holds still long enough for the fight to move through it, and then when the fight ends, the city goes back to being whatever the next episode needs it to be. The chicken fights in this sense are not just the most extreme expression of Peter's physical impossibility. They are moments when the world around Peter briefly becomes more real than it usually is, more solid, more coherent, more committed to being an actual place with actual distances and actual walls that actually break when someone is thrown through them. When the fights end and the world reverts to its usual elastic state, there is a small loss built into that transition. The world was briefly more real during the fight, and now it is less real again. Whether anyone else in Quahog notices this periodic fluctuation in the solidity of their reality is a question the show has never thought to ask. But the fluctuation is there, and it suggests that the world of Family Guy has levels of reality within it, that not all moments are equally grounded, and that the moments of maximum physical violence are somehow the moments when the physical world is most consistently itself. Section 9 continued. More on Meg's relationship to the family. The question of what Meg wants, and whether the show ever genuinely tried to develop her as a character who could pursue what she wanted, is closely connected to a broader question about the show's relationship with female characters generally. Lois, Meg, and to a lesser extent Bonnie Swanson are the show's primary women, and none of them received consistent development that treated their interiority as seriously as the male character's interiority was treated. Lois is interesting in this context because she has been through the most dramatic tonal shift of any character in the show outside of Peter himself. In the early seasons, Lois was the competent, patient, occasionally frustrated center of the family's domestic life. She was the adult in the room when Peter was being a child. She was the one who tried to talk sense into situations before they escalated. She had her own history, her own family background, her own former life before the Griffins, and the show occasionally engaged with that history in ways that gave her genuine depth. Over the seasons, Lois shifted into a character who was simultaneously more openly flawed and more inconsistently written. Episodes revealed that she had a wild past, that she had her own capacity for recklessness and selfishness, that the patient reasonableness of the early seasons was at least partly a performance. Some of this was interesting development. Some of it was the show using Lois as a vehicle for jokes that required her to abandon the consistency she had built. The result was a character who feels less coherent in later seasons than in early ones, not because her complexity increased, but because the inconsistencies multiplied faster than the coherence could absorb them. Meg's situation is the extreme version of this pattern. The show found it easier to use Meg as a target than to develop her as a person, and the longer that pattern held, the harder it became to reverse without acknowledging what had been done. When the show did finally pull back from the worst of the Meg abuse, it did so gradually and without explicit acknowledgement, as if hoping the audience would simply notice that things had improved without asking why they had been bad in the first place. What Meg represents at her best, in the episodes where the show remembered what she was capable of, is the experience of being young and wanting more than your circumstances seem to allow. She is constrained by her family, by her school, by the town, by the show itself. The constraints are different in nature, but the feeling they produce is the same. The feeling of having desires that the world around you is not interested in accommodating. That feeling is one of the most universal in human experience, and in a show that often aimed for the specific rather than the universal, Meg was the character who could have connected the specific Griffin family chaos to something that any viewer could recognize in their own life. The show did not consistently reach for that potential, but it was always there, waiting, in the character that everybody thought was just the target. Section 10 continued. More on the house's strange history. The phone number of the Griffin house has been given on screen as 555-666-0112. The 555 prefix is the traditional placeholder for fictional telephone numbers in American media, established because 555 numbers are not assigned to real telephone subscribers, which prevents viewers from calling a number shown on screen. The use of 555 is completely standard for any American film or television show that needs to display a phone number. What is unusual is the 666, which is traditionally associated in Christian symbolism with the number of the beast from the Book of Revelation. Whether this was intentional, dark humor from the production team, a random choice that happened to include that digit string, or a deliberate Easter egg for attentive viewers has never been officially confirmed. The house phone number is one of several small details embedded in the show that reward very close attention without ever being directly called out by the show itself. Another is the license plate on Peter's car, which changes between episodes. Another is the position of specific items on the refrigerator door, which shift between scenes within the same episode. Another is the presence or absence of specific framed photos on the walls of the living room, which has varied over the seasons in ways that do not correspond to any story development. These details are not Easter eggs in the conventional sense. They are not puzzles with solutions. They are simply the accumulated result of hundreds of different artists and animators working on the show across its run, each making small decisions about what appears in the frame, most of those decisions not coordinated with anyone else making similar decisions in other episodes. The inconsistencies are the fingerprints of a large creative enterprise, rather than the breadcrumbs of a puzzle. But they accumulate into a texture of specificity that makes the house feel inhabited and observed even when its architecture makes no sense. The backyard of the house is home to one of the show's most persistent atmospheric details, the Providence skyline visible in the background. This detail appears in many backyard scenes across many seasons, and its consistency is unusual given how inconsistent the house's interior is. The decision to keep the skyline visible, to maintain that specific geographic anchor even when everything else about the house's location was vague and shifting, suggests that the production team valued the skyline as an identifier in a way they did not value the house's floor plan. The skyline says where you are. The floor plan just says how the rooms connect. And in a show that has decided the rooms will connect however the joke requires, the floor plan is less important. The skyline is Quahog's one fixed point. Everything else floats, shifts, rearranges. But those three buildings on the Providence horizon are always there when the show needs to remind you that this story, however impossible, is happening somewhere specific. It is happening in Rhode Island. It is happening in a place that exists, even if the fictional version of that place is assembled from imagination and comedy logic rather than geography. The skyline is the show's commitment to a world, the minimum amount of commitment required to make the rest of the impossibility feel grounded. Section 11 continued. More on the show's forgotten characters. Patrick Pewterschmidt, Lois's older brother, is one of the show's most genuinely underused supporting characters. He was introduced as a man who witnessed his mother's affair with Jackie Gleason as a child, which traumatized him into becoming what the show describes as a serial killer of fat men. This is an extraordinary character premise. Lois Griffin's older brother is a serial murderer with a specific victim profile connected to a childhood trauma. He was committed to a mental institution after his first run of murders, released by the Griffins who believed he was recovered, and then discovered to be still dangerous. He reappeared in a season 10 episode in an explicit Hannibal Lecter homage, helping solve a case from his cell. And then he simply stopped appearing. The show has not returned to Patrick Pewterschmidt in years. The mystery of Patrick is not why he is dangerous, but why the show created him and then largely abandoned him. He represents one of the few genuinely dark character histories the show has established for someone connected to the main family by blood. Lois has a serial killer brother. This fact has almost no bearing on how the show depicts Lois's life. Her brother's existence, his crimes, his continued incarceration are simply not part of the story the show tells from season to season. He exists in the archive of established facts that Quahog contains and that the show does not visit. Kevin Swanson, Joe, and Bonnie's son, has one of the more genuinely strange continuity histories in the show's supporting cast. He was introduced as a teenager interested in Meg, appeared in a few early episodes, and then was killed off as having died in a war. This death was treated as real within the show's universe. Then, several seasons later, Kevin reappeared alive, with the explanation that he had been part of a conspiracy involving fake deaths and was actually fine. His resurrection was treated matter-of-factly and did not generate any ongoing storyline about how his apparent death had affected his family. He simply came back and the show moved on. Gillian Russell, Brian's former girlfriend, voiced by Drew Barrymore, represents another thread the show picked up and then set down. She was one of Brian's most significantly developed love interests, a woman whose cheerful obliviousness made her a perfect comic counterpoint to Brian's pretensions. Their relationship ran for several seasons and produced some genuinely funny episodes. She married another man, appeared occasionally in subsequent seasons, and has largely faded from the show's regular use. She is one of many characters who were given enough development to feel like they belonged in the world of the show, and were then placed on a shelf where they remain technically still alive and well in Quahog, just not currently part of the story. This is the fate of most of Quahog's supporting cast. Not death, not departure, but a kind of benign neglect that leaves them in the town's population while the show focuses on other things. They are all out there. The Goldmans and the Campbells and the various neighbors and co-workers and classmates who have appeared over the years and then faded from attention. They have their lives. Those lives just do not happen to intersect with the Griffins anymore, or at least not in episodes that have been produced. Quahog is, in this sense, a more fully populated place than the show ever shows us. There are people there whose stories did not end. They simply moved beyond the edge of the camera's attention. Section 12 continued. Final thoughts on the show's self-awareness. The show has on multiple occasions made jokes specifically about its own declining quality, its longevity, and the show's continued existence beyond any creative justification. Characters break the fourth wall to remark that the show has been on too long, that the jokes are getting worse, that the audience deserves better. These moments are played as comedy, as self-aware gags that acknowledge what critics and some fans have been saying about the later seasons. The show seems to think that acknowledging its problems constitutes a kind of resolution of them. This is an interesting and ultimately unresolvable question. Does self-awareness about a creative problem constitute a solution to it? The show seems to believe, or at least to operate as if it believes, that yes, naming the problem demonstrates a level of intelligence that transcends the problem. If we can identify that we are doing this thing and make a joke about doing this thing, then we are above the thing even as we continue doing it. This is a philosophically contentious position, and the critical consensus on it has generally been that self-awareness and quality are separate things, that you can be fully aware of your own problems without solving them. But there is another reading of the show's self-awareness that is more generous. When Family Guy breaks the fourth wall to acknowledge that it has been on too long, or that the cutaways are a crutch, or that the characters have changed in ways that might not be improvements, it is doing something that most shows are too proud or too commercially invested to do. It is telling the truth. It is saying, within its own fiction, that it has a complicated relationship with its own existence, that it continues not because it is at its best, but because it can continue, that the people making it have mixed feelings about making it. That the show and its creator and its creative team all know more about the show's trajectory than any external critic could, and are choosing to keep going with that full knowledge. This kind of honesty, even when it manifests as a joke, is rarer in television than you might think. Most shows maintain the fiction that they are still the shows they always were, that the quality has been consistent, that the critics are wrong, or at least that the audience's continued viewing is validation enough. Family Guy has periodically refused that fiction. It has said, within itself, that things are more complicated than that the show is a strange thing to be making, in a strange position, for reasons that are not entirely creative. That the world of Quahog continues not because it must, but because it can, and because enough people keep watching to make it possible. And the world keeps going. Quahog keeps existing. The Griffins keep having their adventures. The chicken fights keep happening, or happened, until Meg ended them. Brian keeps paying his bills. Stewie keeps building things that should not exist. Peter keeps surviving what should kill him. The house keeps rearranging itself. The town keeps placing itself in a different location every episode. And somewhere in all of that, in the accumulated impossibility of 26 years of this specific kind of strange television, there is something that feels like home. Not in spite of the inconsistencies and the mysteries and the questions that will never be answered. Because of them. This is, in the end, perhaps the deepest mystery of all. Why does a world this inconsistent feel like home? Why do characters this impossible feel like people we know? Why does a town that cannot be found on any map feel like somewhere we could find our way back to? The answer might be the simplest one available. Because the show, at its best, understood something true about how people actually experience the world. Not as a consistent place with clear rules and reliable outcomes, but as a place that is always somewhat larger and stranger than you thought it was, where the rules are more flexible than anyone told you, where the people you love are more mysterious than you can account for, and where the house you grew up in has rooms that do not quite make sense if you think about them too carefully. Family Guy is not a great show by the standards of what television has demonstrated it can be. But it is a genuinely strange and sometimes beautiful thing. A 26-year accumulation of mysteries that nobody solved, in a world that nobody fully explained, about people who nobody could entirely account for. And on the right night, with the volume low and the hour late and the need for something familiar and strange in equal measure, it is exactly the right place to be. Extra depth. Peter and the Giant Chicken. A complete history. The fight between Peter Griffin and the giant chicken named Ernie is one of the most sustained and ambitious recurring bits in the history of animated television. It is worth examining in full detail because, within its apparent absurdity, there is an enormous amount of craft, and because the backstory the show has given it, across dozens of episodes, reveals something specific about how the show understands consequence, memory, and the question of when a conflict should end. The first fight happened in the Season 2 episode Da Boom. Peter is given an expired coupon by a large anthropomorphic chicken in a suit and tie. Peter tries to use the coupon. It is rejected because it has expired. The chicken, apparently personally offended by Peter's attempt to use the invalid coupon, attacks him. What follows is a sequence that goes on for several minutes of screen time, during which Peter and the chicken trade blows through increasingly implausible environments. They fall through floors. They crash through walls. They end up on a speeding boat and then clinging to the outside of a vehicle, and then in multiple other locations that seem to multiply impossibly around them. The fight ends inconclusively. Both parties limp away. This is the pattern that repeats in every subsequent fight, the same explosive beginning triggered by some new version of the original grievance or a fresh insult, the same sustained escalation through increasingly extreme environments, and the same inconclusive ending where both Peter and the chicken are equally destroyed, rest briefly, and then resume normal life as if the fight had not significantly altered the physical landscape of Quahog. The chicken's name, Ernie, is confirmed in the Season 4 episode Blind Ambition. His wife is named Nicole. The fact that he has a wife named Nicole, that he maintains a domestic life in between his catastrophic wars with Peter, is one of the show's most wonderfully unexplored details. What does Nicole know about Ernie's feud with Peter? Does she worry every time he leaves the house? Has she ever tried to mediate? Does she know why the fight started? The show has never visited the chicken household in a way that would answer these questions. Ernie exists as a fighting opponent and as a person with a domestic life, and those two aspects of his existence never seem to intersect within the narrative. The physics of the chicken fights are their own category of physical impossibility, distinct from Peter's general physical impossibility. During the fights, both Peter and Ernie demonstrate capabilities neither of them demonstrates in any other context. They fall from heights that should be fatal and immediately continue fighting. They are hit by vehicles and thrown through structural supports and submerged in water and exposed to explosive pressure, and they absorb all of it with the specific elasticity of action movie combatants who are immune to anything that happens between set pieces. The world they fight through is more destructible than they are. Walls crumble, vehicles explode, infrastructure fails. Peter and Ernie remain functional throughout. The ending of the chicken fight era, which came in the season 22 episode Family Guy Light, is one of the show's genuinely surprising narrative moments. In this episode, Meg learns martial arts, and when the latest round of the Peter and Ernie fight spills into her path, she defeats Ernie herself. Not with the escalating absurdity that characterizes the fights between the two principals, but with calm, competent martial arts skill applied directly to the problem. The fight simply ends because someone capable enough walked into it and ended it. The Great War of Spooner Street, the conflict that had been running across 20 years of television, concluded not with a grand finale but with a teenage girl who had learned to handle herself. It is a surprisingly elegant ending for something so enormous in the show's history, and it connects to the broader question of what Meg Griffin is when the show actually engages with her as a character rather than as a target. Extra depth. Cleveland Brown and what his departure tells us. Cleveland Brown existed as one of Peter's core friend group from the very first episode of the series. He was soft-spoken, patient, good-natured, and perpetually placed in situations that destroyed his property, particularly his bathtub, which fell from his second-floor bathroom through his house and onto the street below, with enough regularity that it became one of the show's most recognized running gags. Cleveland's patience in the face of ongoing disaster, his fundamental decency, and his warm relationship with his circle of friends made him a stabilizing presence in the show's social world during its early seasons. In 2009, Cleveland left Quahog. He moved back to his hometown of Stoolbend, Virginia, to reconnect with a childhood sweetheart named Donna. The departure was handled through a spin-off series called The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons on Fox from 2009 to 2013. The Cleveland Show is its own interesting object. A Family Guy spin-off that attempted to establish an independent identity while remaining connected to the original show's universe, and that ultimately did not build an audience large enough to sustain itself, ending after its 4th season. Within the Family Guy universe, Cleveland's departure created a gap in the friend group that the show filled partially with the introduction of characters who cycled in and out without fully replacing him. The dynamic of Peter, Cleveland, Quagmire, and Joe had been carefully balanced in the early seasons. Each character brought something specific. Cleveland was the calm voice, Quagmire was the unfiltered id, Joe was the capable professional diminished by circumstance. Peter was the engine of chaos. When Cleveland left, the balance shifted in ways that never fully corrected. When Cleveland returned to Quahog after the Cleveland Show ended, he was reintegrated into the friend group with relatively little fanfare, as if he had never been gone. The show did not dwell on what 4 seasons of Cleveland's independent life meant for his character or his relationships. He was simply back, at the Drunken Clam, ready for the next adventure. This reintegration is characteristic of the show's general approach to continuity. Changes that happened in one context do not always carry weight in another. Cleveland went away, built an entire life in Virginia, raised a blended family, and came back essentially unchanged, which either means that 4 seasons of experience left no lasting mark on him, or that the show decided continuity from the spin-off was not worth tracking. Extra depth. Brian's novel and the unfinished story. The novel that Brian Griffin has been writing for essentially the entire run of the show exists in the show's universe as a persistent object, a thing that is real and ongoing and unfinished, never quite resolved into either completion or definitive abandonment. Characters reference it. Brian references it himself. Episodes have been built around the question of whether it will ever be done, whether it is any good, what it actually contains. What we know about the novel is limited. It is a serious literary work, or at least Bryan presents it as one. It is not a genre novel. It is not a thriller or a mystery or a romance. It is the kind of book that Bryan would describe as significant, that he would cite as evidence of his intellectual seriousness and artistic ambition. He has been working on it for years within the show's timeline, which in real terms means he has been working on it for the entirety of the show's run across a quarter-century of television. The episode Bryan's Got a Brand New Bag in Season 9 establishes that Bryan's self-help book, Wish It, Want It, Do It, was written quickly and became a bestseller, which is precisely the wrong kind of success for someone with Bryan's particular vanity about literary quality. The best-selling self-help book is everything the literary novel is not: commercially successful, easy to dismiss critically, popular with exactly the kind of readers Bryan would not want to impress. The fact that this is what Bryan produces when he actually finishes something is the show's most precise observation about the gap between Bryan's self-image and his actual creative output. But the literary novel persists alongside the self-help book in the show's mythology. Bryan has not abandoned it. He simply has not finished it. This is not unusual for writers. Many people with serious literary ambitions produce commercial work to pay bills, while the real project remains permanently in progress. What makes Bryan's situation strange is the duration. No amount of time that Bryan spends on the novel ever seems to move it toward completion. The manuscript exists, somewhere in the Griffin House, in some number of pages, and it remains exactly as unfinished as it has always been, regardless of how many years pass. The unfinished novel is a metaphor the show has never explicitly named, but that fans have discussed at length. Bryan's literary ambitions are the aspect of his character most clearly connected to his self-image as an intellectual, as someone more sophisticated and more serious than the world around him gives him credit for being. The novel represents the proof he is always promising but never delivering. If it were finished, if it were published, if it were critically acclaimed, Bryan's self-perception would be validated. The fact that it remains unfinished keeps him in a permanent state of potential, where the proof of his worth is always coming, always promised, never quite here. There is something almost compassionate about the show's handling of this, or there would be if it were handled more consistently. The unfinished novel as a character detail creates genuine sympathy for Bryan, because almost everyone knows the feeling of a project that keeps being promised to yourself that never arrives. The novel is the thing Bryan will write when everything else is sorted. And everything else never gets fully sorted, so the novel never gets written, and Bryan keeps being a person who is working on a novel rather than a person who wrote one. Extra depth: Stewie's relationship to time and its implications. Stewie's time machine, which has appeared in dozens of episodes, is not presented as a prototype or an experiment. It is a working, reliable piece of technology that Stewie built in his nursery. It functions consistently enough that both he and Bryan use it as a travel method with the same casual confidence you might use a car. The time machine exists. It works. The implications of this should be enormous, and in a more consequence-oriented show, they would be. In the episode Road to the Multiverse, Stewie provides Bryan with a remote control that allows travel between alternate universes rather than alternate times. This is a different technology from the time machine, requiring different principles to operate, which means Stewie has mastered both temporal mechanics and dimensional physics. He was, at the time of this episode, approximately 1 year old. The gap between what Stewie can do and what a normal 1-year-old child can do is not a matter of degree. It is a category difference. The show addressed this most directly in the episode Stewie Kills Lois, and Lois Kills Stewie, the 2-part Season 6 finale, where Stewie finally achieves his primary stated goal of killing Lois and taking over the world. The reveal that this was all a computer simulation on Stewie's personal computer is played as a twist, but it also tells us something about the sophistication of the technology Stewie has built. He has constructed a simulation detailed enough to model realistic human behavior across an extended period of time, to simulate political events and military responses and interpersonal dynamics, all within a device that sits in a nursery belonging to a baby who is also learning to walk. The simulation is not a video game. It is a predictive model sophisticated enough to serve as a genuine test run for world domination strategy. Stewie uses it to evaluate whether his plans would work before implementing them, which is, on its own terms, genuinely brilliant applied technology. The relationship between Stewie and Brian, built through time travel and dimensional travel episodes, is arguably the most emotionally substantial relationship in the show across its full run. The Christmas Guy episode, in which Stewie travels back in time to save Brian from being hit by the car that kills him, is structured entirely around the depth of that bond. Stewie gives up his own time travel device to save Brian's life, sacrificing his most powerful piece of technology, the thing that makes him uniquely capable in the show's universe, because living without Brian is not something he is willing to accept. This is not the behavior of the cold, calculating villain the early Stewie aspired to be. This is the behavior of someone who has found the thing that matters most to him and is willing to give up everything else to protect it. The tragedy of this moment, if you are willing to read it as tragedy rather than comedy, is what it reveals about the arc of Stewie's character overall. The evil genius who wanted to conquer the world ended up conquering nothing, building nothing permanent, changing nothing at the scale he originally intended. What he built instead was a friendship, and the friendship turned out to matter more than any world domination plan ever could have. Whether this represents growth or loss, or both simultaneously, is one of the most genuinely interesting questions the show raises without answering. Extra depth. Lois Griffin and the person behind the patience. Lois Griffin exists at the center of the show's domestic universe in a way that is easy to overlook because the show rarely pauses to examine her with the same attention it gives to Peter or Brian or Stewie. She is the manager of the Griffin household, the person who absorbs the chaos generated by everyone around her and works to maintain something approaching stability in a family that constantly works against stability. This role is essential and largely thankless in the narrative, and it has produced a character whose inner life the show has engaged with inconsistently and whose history is richer and stranger than most viewers remember. Lois was born Lois Pewterschmidt, the daughter of Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, one of the wealthiest families in New England. Her childhood in Cherrywood Manor was privileged in ways that the adult Lois almost never references, unless an episode specifically requires her to. She attended private schools. She had a debutante life, the kind of life that the social world of coastal New England affluence constructs for its daughters. She plays the piano with genuine skill, a detail the early seasons remembered more consistently than the later ones. She was classically trained, a product of a specific kind of upper-class East Coast education, and then she met Peter Griffin at a party and fell completely in love with him, to the permanent bewilderment of her family, particularly her father Carter. The nature of this attraction? The specific thing about Peter that made Lois willing to walk away from an entire world of wealth and social expectation to build a different life with a man her family considered completely unsuitable is something the show has addressed occasionally in flashback episodes but never fully explained. The simplest answer is that Peter was funny and unpredictable and represented something entirely outside the world she was being prepared for, and that this was exactly what she needed at exactly the right time. The more complex answer involves the specific dynamics of growing up as the daughter of Carter Pewterschmidt, a man of towering coldness and specific expectations, and how that upbringing might produce a young woman who is drawn to someone her father disapproves of on principle. Her past before Peter includes several details the show has revealed across its run that add texture to the woman she was before the show begins. She was once good friends with a woman who grew up to become a killer. She had a wild phase, referenced in multiple episodes, during which her behavior was significantly more reckless than her current domestic life would suggest. She has a brother who committed multiple murders and is institutionalized. Her family tree connects her to a level of inherited privilege and also to a level of dysfunction that her calm surface management of family life never quite obscures. The Lois of the early seasons was someone you could root for, capable, patient, genuinely loving toward Peter despite everything, maintaining her own sense of self while managing a household that constantly threatened to overwhelm any single person. The Lois of the later seasons became less consistent, her behavior more variable, her personality more subject to the requirements of individual episodes rather than an underlying coherent character. She has been selfish in ways that contradicted her established selflessness. She has been cold in ways that contradicted her established warmth. The inconsistency is a function of the show's general drift away from character coherence in its later seasons. But Lois feels the drift more than almost anyone because the early version of her character was so specifically defined. She is, in the end, the person holding the show's domestic universe together in the same way she holds the Griffin family together. Not because she is the most powerful or the most interesting or the most dramatically compelling character in the room, but because without her specific function, everything around her would collapse into a state the show could not sustain. Section 5. Stewie Griffin and the impossibility of a 1-year-old. Stewie Griffin was born on a date that has been given differently in different episodes, but the show has treated him as being approximately 1-year-old for the entire run of the series. He is explicitly a baby. He wears diapers. He needs to be lifted and carried. He sleeps in a crib. He drinks from a bottle. He uses a high chair. He has the physical form and developmental stage of a human infant in his first year of life. He also has a master's level understanding of theoretical and applied physics. He has built multiple working time machines from scratch, including a wristwatch version, a handheld return pad system, and a full walk-in chamber. He constructed a particle accelerator. He designed and built a weather manipulation device in an early episode. He created mind control technologies, laser rifles, dimensional transceivers, and a portal gun. He speaks with a refined, elaborate British accent and uses vocabulary that would challenge most university graduates. He has quoted and engaged with works of literature, political philosophy, and theoretical science that require years of formal education to even access, let alone master. He can pilot aircraft. He can operate military vehicles. He has knowledge of covert operations methodology, international intelligence tradecraft, and strategic planning at a level that intelligence agencies would classify as expert. He is, in the official story of the show, 1-year-old. The question of how Stewie knows what he knows is the show's most genuinely unresolved mystery, and over the years the show has offered several partial explanations that are more interesting for what they leave unsaid than for what they actually clarify. The most cosmically ambitious of these partial explanations comes from the Season 8 episode called The Big Bang Theory, which is among the most philosophically ambitious television the show has ever produced. In this episode, Stewie and Brian find themselves trapped outside the space-time continuum entirely. They have been pushed through a boundary beyond which no physical laws exist, into a region that is, in Stewie's description, outside of existence itself. No past, no present, no future. Nothing. The return pad, which normally operates by locking onto the physical coordinates of the home universe, cannot function because there are no physical laws for it to operate on. Stewie realizes that the only way back is to overload the return pad's reactor. The explosion this would create would need to be enormous, essentially a universe-creating explosion, the kind of energy release that could seed the formation of matter and space-time itself. He does it. They are propelled back into reality. Later back home, Stewie does the mathematics and discovers that the energy spectrum of the return pad explosion matches exactly with the cosmic background radiation of the known universe, the faint microwave glow left over from the Big Bang itself. The conclusion is inescapable. Stewie's return pad explosion was the Big Bang. The universe began because Stewie needed to get home. The temporal structure of this revelation is a closed loop. The universe created Stewie, and Stewie created the universe. And both of these things are equally true in an eternal cycle that has no identifiable starting point. The universe has always existed because Stewie has always existed to create it. Stewie has always existed because the universe has always existed to make him possible. This is a genuinely unusual piece of cosmological logic to embed in the middle of an animated comedy about a dysfunctional family, and the show drops it almost casually, allowing the implication to sit without belaboring it. The further implication, which the episode raises but does not fully articulate, is that Stewie's existence is not contingent. He is not a product of accident. He was not simply the lucky outcome of particular circumstances in the Griffin family. He is a necessary feature of the universe, the being whose return home is the reason there is a home to return to. Whatever Stewie is, he is something the universe cannot exist without. His ancestral connection to Leonardo da Vinci adds another dimension to this. In the episode where Stewie's nemesis Bertram travels back in time to kill da Vinci and thereby erase Stewie from existence, the show establishes that Stewie is a direct descendant of the Renaissance genius. This is handled through a specific genetic visual marker. Stewie's distinctive football-shaped head is shared by earlier ancestors shown in the episode. including a medieval figure and Da Vinci himself as the show depicts him. The implication is that this head shape, this unusual cranial structure, is a hereditary trait passing through a specific bloodline across centuries. Stewie is not just intelligent. He comes from a line of unusually intelligent people, the most extreme current expression of a genetic potential that has been accumulating and refining itself since at least the 15th century. The football head itself is a separate continuity mystery. In the episode Stuck Together, Torn Apart, a flashback shows that Stewie originally had a more standard round head shape as an infant, and that the distinctive elongated shape was caused by hitting his head on a ceiling while bouncing on a bed. But this directly contradicts an earlier episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, which shows a flashback of Stewie in Lois's womb and at the moment of his birth, and in those flashbacks his head is already the football shape. The show cannot have it both ways. Either the ceiling caused the shape or it did not. The earlier episode and the later episode present mutually exclusive versions of the same physical fact, and no subsequent episode has addressed the contradiction. What you are left with is a head that both always existed in that shape and was created by an accidental ceiling encounter, depending on which episode you consider authoritative. His half-brother Bertram shares the football head shape, which further complicates the ceiling theory. Bertram is also the child of Peter Griffin, conceived through a fertility clinic where Peter donated genetic material. If Bertram has the same head shape as Stewie, and if Bertram and Stewie share a father, then the head shape must come from Peter's genetic line. But Peter's head is noticeably square, not football-shaped, so if the trait comes from Peter, it must be a recessive or variant expression of something latent in the Griffin bloodline. This is more genetics than the show was intending to invoke, but the show's own canon creates the need for these questions. Stewie's time machine, built for the first time in the Season 1 episode Mind Over Murder originally as a tool to avoid the discomfort of teething, has been one of the show's most reliably consequential recurring props. It has appeared in various forms throughout the series, from a wristwatch version to a walk-in chamber to the handheld return pad system that he and Brian use most frequently in their adventures. The machine has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. In the episode Life of Brian, Stewie destroyed his time machine shortly before Brian was killed, which left him temporarily unable to reverse the death. He later found a way, by encountering his past self on a trip to the future and borrowing the past self's return pad, an elegant solution that required Stewie to encounter himself across time, which raises its own set of questions about how time works in a universe where that kind of encounter is possible. The show's most ambitious treatment of Stewie's time travel involved the episode Back to the Pilot, where Brian and Stewie travel back to the very first episode of the show in 1999. In this episode, they not only interact with their past selves, but also comment on the animation quality of the early season. This is the show watching itself, acknowledging itself as an artifact with a history. When Brian tells his 1,999 self about the September 11 attacks and accidentally creates an alternate timeline where George W. Bush, having no crisis to exploit, starts a second American Civil War, the episode demonstrates that temporal interventions in this universe have genuine consequences that must be carefully undone. The mechanics of Stewie's time travel have more internal consistency than you would expect from a comedy series, and the fan communities that have analyzed them in detail have generally found them to hold together reasonably well. What Stewie ultimately represents in the show's universe is the most extreme possible inversion of what a baby is supposed to be. A baby is defined by its dependence, its incompleteness, its need to be shaped and guided and taught. Stewie arrived complete. He arrived capable. He arrived with the universe inside him, whether literally as the Big Bang Theory suggests or metaphorically as his intelligence and capability suggest. He is the baby who did not need anything that babies are supposed to need. And the show's gradual softening of that premise over the seasons, the movement away from the all-capable evil genius toward the emotionally vulnerable, friendship-seeking version of Stewie that populated the later episodes, can be read as the show's attempt to give him something he did not start with, the experience of actually needing someone else. Whether you find the softer Stewie more or less interesting than the original depends entirely on what you valued in the character. But the mystery of who he actually is, this baby who built the universe and cannot explain where he learned to speak English with a British accent, remains the most purely unanswerable question the show has ever posed. Section 6. The Multiverse and what it means that infinite quahogs exist. In September 2009, the 8th season of Family Guy opened with a single episode that changed how every previous and subsequent episode of the show can potentially be interpreted. Road to the Multiverse was the show's 5th Road to episode, a recurring adventure format where Brian and Stewie travel somewhere together, and it drew 10.17 million viewers on its original broadcast, the show's highest rating since the Season 6 episode McStroke. Critics praised it with particular warmth, calling it one of the best episodes the show had produced in years. It earned every word of that praise. In the episode, Stewie reveals that he has built an interdimensional remote control capable of transporting the user to any one of an infinite number of parallel universes, each coexisting with the Prime Universe on separate dimensional planes. He explains the theory to Brian with characteristic condescension, accusing Brian of repeating the last 2 words of every sentence to pretend he understood it. Then they start jumping between universes. The universes they visit are each drawn in a different animation style with a different internal logic. There is a universe where Christianity never existed, allowing science to advance unimpeded by centuries of institutional skepticism, meaning that humanity is roughly 1,000 years more technologically advanced than in the Prime timeline. The animation of this universe is sleek, detailed, and futuristic, and Brian is momentarily seduced by its attractive version of Meg before Stewie pulls him away. There is a universe drawn in the style of the Flintstones, where everything is made of stone and everyone uses the word rock in every sentence. There is a universe where Japan won World War II and America is a Japanese cultural satellite. There is a universe animated in the style of classic Disney films from the 1930s and 1940s, all fluid curves and big innocent eyes, where everyone is slightly disturbing in the specific way that early Disney characters are slightly disturbing. There is a universe consisting of robot chicken stop-motion animation directly parodying Family Guy's sister show. There are two-headed people, a universe in permanent ice age, a universe populated entirely by gay men, a universe where everyone simultaneously needs to use the bathroom, and a live-action universe where Brian and Stewie appear as a real white Labrador and a real baby on screen. The episode is joyful and clever and technically impressive and genuinely funny. But beyond being a good episode, it formally establishes something about the show's universe that transforms how you can think about everything else. There are infinite quahogs. There are infinite griffins. There are infinite versions of every moment that has ever been depicted in the show, playing out across parallel dimensional planes simultaneously. Every story the show has ever told is true somewhere. Every alternate outcome the show has ever reversed is still playing out in some corner of the multiverse. The timeline where Brian stays dead exists. The timeline where Peter ended up with Molly Ringwald instead of Lois exists. The timeline where Brian's warning about September 11 resulted in a second American Civil War exists. All of these timelines are real, and all of them are continuing. This framework has a specific implication for the show's well-documented inconsistencies. When a character behaves in a Season 8 episode in ways that directly contradict how they behaved in a Season 2 episode, the multiverse provides an in-universe explanation for the discrepancy. These are simply different branches of the timeline. The character has made different choices in different realities. The reset button that the show uses to restore the status quo after dramatic events is not a failure of continuity. It is the selection of a specific branch from an infinite menu. When the show restores things to normal after a dramatic event, it is choosing which timeline to follow going forward, not denying that the alternative timeline exists. There is a widely discussed fan theory that builds on this framework to explain the most significant tonal and character shift in the show's history. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002 and then returned from cancellation in 2005, the show was noticeably different. The characters were edgier, the humor was darker, the animation style had changed, the writing room was different. The theory suggests that the show that returned in 2005 was not the same show that was canceled in 2002. When Stewie and Brian traveled back in the episode back to the pilot to observe the very first episode, they were not visiting their own past. They were visiting a parallel universe, one where the show had its original run and was canceled and stayed canceled. The Family Guy we watch now is not the Family Guy of the original timeline. It is an alternate version, one where the show came back but came back as something slightly different. This theory cannot be definitively proven or disproven within the show's own canon, which is part of what makes it satisfying to contemplate. It accounts for the differences between the early and later show without requiring us to attribute those differences entirely to corporate pressure or creative fatigue. The Dog Universe, one of the alternate realities visited in Road to the Multiverse, is particularly rich with implication. In this universe, the social hierarchy of humans and dogs has been inverted. Dogs walk upright, wear clothes, attend school, build civilization, and keep humans as pets. When Brian, our Brian, the dog, arrives in this universe, he is treated with the same casual contempt that humans in his home universe sometimes direct at dogs. He is seen as a lower form of life. The dog citizens of this universe have internalized the same assumptions about hierarchy that our universe's humans hold about dogs, and they have simply inverted the social positions. When Brian visits the alternate Griffin house and finds dogs where humans should be, he encounters a human version of himself, a Caucasian man with black hair in the shape of Brian's skull, a large nose in the shape of Brian's muzzle, a white sweater, and Brian's collar. This human Brian represents what Brian would have been if his consciousness had been placed in a human body instead of a dog's. Or perhaps this human Brian represents what Brian secretly suspects he already is, a human mind that happened to land in the wrong body. The dog universe simply shows that dissonance inverted, made visible, made literal. The multiverse also interacts with Stewie's time machine in ways that create what physicists would call branching timeline effects. Each time Stewie and Brian alter the past, they are not simply changing their own future. They are creating a new branch of the timeline that diverges from the original at the point of the change. The original timeline continues to exist unchanged. The intervention creates an additional reality rather than replacing an existing one. This means that every temporal intervention Stewie has ever made, and he has made many, has created additional branches of reality, each one different from his home timeline by the specific change he introduced. The implications of this for the show's cosmology are genuinely staggering. Stewie has been altering the past across multiple episodes across many seasons. Each alteration has created a new universe. The multiverse has been growing, accreting new branches with each of Stewie's adventures, each of Brian's accidental misuses of the time machine, each of the show's plot-driven temporal manipulations. The space of possible quahogs has been expanding throughout the show's run, getting more complex and more densely populated with alternate realities every time someone picks up the return pad. And at the center of all of this, sitting in a baby's crib in a room full of weapons he built himself, in a house on Spooner Street in a town that cannot be found on any real map, is a 1-year-old baby who apparently caused the Big Bang. Every universe in the multiverse, every branch of every timeline, every alternate version of every moment in every version of Quahog exists because of him. The show has quietly built the most ambitious cosmological backstory in animated television history around a baby who still needs his diaper changed, and it did it mostly between the jokes. Section 7. Death, Resurrection, and the show's relationship with endings. Family Guy has a complicated and deeply inconsistent relationship with the idea of permanent change. Characters die and come back, situations resolve and then reset, lessons are learned and immediately forgotten. The show operates on what might generously be called episodic logic. Each episode is largely self-contained, and the events of one rarely constrain the events of the next. But within this general pattern of impermanence, there are specific deaths and specific changes that have been maintained, and the selection of which ones matter reveals something about what the show actually values. The most unexpected and well-maintained permanent death in the show's history is Muriel Goldman, the wife of pharmacist Mort Goldman. She was killed in the Season 9 episode, And Then There Were Fewer, a feature-length murder mystery special set in James Woods' mansion during a dinner party that turns lethal. The episode was based on the Agatha Christie structure of And Then There Were None, and it committed to the premise with unusual seriousness for a comedy show. People actually die, the deaths matter within the episode, and the stakes feel real. Muriel was among the characters who did not survive. She has not returned. Mort's life changed around her absence. Neil's dynamic shifted. The loss was maintained, which is actually quite unusual for a show that has demonstrated an ability and willingness to reverse almost anything. Diane Simmons, the news anchor who turned out to be the episode's actual killer, was shot dead by Stewie at the episode's climax and has remained dead. Her absence from subsequent episodes has been consistent. Tom Tucker, her former co-anchor, has had to navigate the show's fictional news landscape without her, a change that was honored rather than quietly undone. These two deaths, Muriel and Diane, represent the clearest examples the show has produced of consequences that were imposed and then respected over the long term. Mayor Adam West's retirement from the show, handled with care in response to Adam West, the actor's death in 2017, created a civic void in the town that the show acknowledged without fully filling. The subsequent renaming of the high school and the general treatment of the character's memory as something worth honoring represents one of the show's genuinely moving responses to a real-world loss. The bartender Horace died in season 11 by a foul ball at a baseball game, one of the more anticlimactic exits for a character who had been a fixture for a decade. His replacement by Jerome was maintained. Jerome has been present in the show's drunken clam scenes ever since, established enough now to feel like he was always there. Then there are the deaths that clearly never mattered. Peter Griffin has been killed, or apparently killed, so many times that a comprehensive list would run for pages. He has been beheaded and revived in the same episode. He has survived explosions, drownings, vehicle impacts, falls from extreme heights, and a variety of other lethal scenarios. The death never sticks because the show has never genuinely committed to a world in which Peter is absent. His role is too central. His function is too necessary. The show cannot be Family Guy without Peter Griffin, and so Peter Griffin cannot die. Death himself, as a recurring character, is one of the show's more philosophically interesting choices. The Grim Reaper appears as a figure who shows up in a rumpled robe and sneakers, seems perpetually tired of his work, and interacts with the Griffins with the comfortable familiarity of a neighbor who has been around for years. He is not frightening. He is not majestic. He is functional. He drives somewhere, does his job, goes home. The comedy of his appearances consistently comes from the mundanity of his presentation. He is the infinite mystery of mortality rendered as a harried middle manager. His most significant storyline, Death is a Bitch, reveals the mechanism of how death works in Quahog. If death is injured and cannot collect souls, nobody can die. This is presented as a logistical problem rather than a tragedy. There are people scheduled to die who cannot, which creates a backlog and a series of awkward situations. The premise contains an unstated implication. Death is not a force of nature in this universe. It is a service. Someone shows up and does it. If the person who does it cannot work, it does not happen. This explains, in a roundabout way, why death in Quahog is so reversible. The machinery of mortality is managed by a character who can be distracted, can be incapacitated, can be argued with, and can occasionally be persuaded to look the other way. Brian's death and resurrection deserves a final extended look because it represents the show's most direct engagement with the question of what permanence means within its universe. Life of Brian aired in November 2013. Brian was struck by a car and killed. The show managed the grief of the event with more care than anyone expected, giving Stewie's devastation in particular a quality of real anguish that felt earned by everything the characters had been to each other across 12 seasons. Vinny the replacement dog was introduced with enough character development to suggest genuine investment in the transition. 6 weeks of television time passed. Then, Christmas Guy aired. Stewie used a time travel device to go back and save Brian. Brian returned. Everything reset. The driver of the car was never identified. When Brian was killed, a car came around the corner and hit him. We saw the car. We did not see who was driving it. In the weeks between Brian's death and his resurrection, extensive fan theories circulated about who the driver might be, some suggesting it would turn out to be a villain, some suggesting it would be someone from Brian's past, some suggesting it would matter for the story. It did not matter for the story. The resurrection rendered the question moot within the narrative. But the unanswered question of who was behind the wheel remains technically open in the show's canon, a mystery that has no solution because the puzzle itself was dismantled before anyone solved it. This is, in its own quiet way, the perfect summary of how Family Guy treats its own mysteries. The question is created. The question is allowed to float. The conditions under which the question could be answered are removed. And the question remains, not because anyone cares about the answer anymore, but because the architecture of the show created it and then forgot to close it. In a world with an infinite multiverse and a grim reaper who sprains his ankle, maybe every unanswered question is just a story that got its ending swapped out for a different one at the last minute. Section 8. Ernie the Chicken and the War That Started Over a Coupon. The whole thing started with a coupon. An expired coupon specifically. That is the origin of one of the most elaborate, sustained, and physically destructive feuds in the history of animated television. Peter Griffin received a promotional coupon from a giant anthropomorphic chicken. The coupon offered a discount at some establishment in Quahog. When Peter attempted to redeem it, he discovered that it had passed its expiration date. Peter's response to this consumer disappointment was to physically assault the chicken. The chicken responded in kind. What followed was a fight sequence that moved through multiple city blocks, destroyed several buildings, produced significant property damage, and ended with Peter apparently killing the chicken by slamming his head into a photocopier and then falling off a building onto him. Then the chicken opened one eye. This is the entire beginning. A coupon, a punch, a fight through a city, an eye opening. Everything that followed, every chicken fight across more than 20 seasons, every building destroyed and every bystander caught in the crossfire, every time the two of them locked eyes across a distance and immediately started running toward each other, descends from a promotional offer that someone forgot to honor before its redemption date. The elegance of this premise is worth sitting with for a moment. The feud between Peter and the chicken is one of the most disproportionate things in a show built on disproportionate responses. The original grievance is so small, so mundane, so entirely ordinary as a consumer complaint, that the violence it unleashed is funny precisely because the two things cannot be held in the mind simultaneously without generating a kind of cognitive dissonance that manifests as laughter. An expired coupon and two combatants fighting through an airport. An expired coupon and a chase sequence across a city. An expired coupon and a decades-long war that has destroyed more of Quahog than any natural disaster the show has depicted. The chicken's full name is Ernie, revealed in a Season 4 dinner scene by his wife Nicole, herself also a giant chicken. Ernie and Nicole have a son. They have a marriage. They have a life in Quahog that operates parallel to Peter's life, with Ernie apparently holding down some kind of employment or social standing that the show has never fully detailed. He is not a monster or a villain in the conventional sense. He is a large anthropomorphic chicken with a grievance and an inexplicable inability to stay dead. The dinner at which Nicole reveals Ernie's name is one of the most structurally interesting Ernie appearances in the show's history. The episode approaches the feud as something ordinary couples might discuss and resolve over a meal. Peter and Ernie sit across from each other. Nicole fills in Ernie's name. The conversation turns to the original coupon. Both men acknowledge the absurdity. They approach something that looks like peace. And then, just as the meal seems to have been a genuine thaw in the long war, a new argument breaks out over who should pay the bill. The fight resumes. The restaurant is destroyed. Nicole watches her husband's newly resolved grievances immediately reignite over something as trivial as the original offense. This is the essential truth of the Ernie feud, and the essential truth of the show's understanding of how Peter operates. The specific occasion for violence does not matter. What matters is the quality in Peter, or in the specific relationship between Peter and Ernie, that converts any friction into maximum force. Peter is not capable of proportionate response when he feels he has been slighted. Ernie is not capable of letting a slight go unanswered when it comes from Peter. Together, they form a system that is guaranteed to produce violence from any input, no matter how small. The backstory of the very first encounter was further complicated by a later time travel episode. In Meet the Quagmires, Peter's meddling in 1984 causes him to accidentally punch Ernie during a dance at a school event. This means that in the altered timeline, the punch predates the coupon. The show uses this to suggest that the feud's origin might run even deeper than the expired coupon, that something between these two was always destined to be violent, and that the coupon was merely the occasion rather than the cause. In a universe with time travel and infinite parallel universes, perhaps Peter and Ernie have been fighting across every timeline, every version of Quahog, for reasons that extend beyond any single incident. The fight sequences themselves have been produced with unusual craft throughout the show's run. The animation during chicken fights functions like action movie choreography. The combatants enter a location, fight through it, exit from one side, continue into a new location, fight through that, and so on, often covering several distinct environments in a single sequence. They interact with the architecture of Quahog in ways that suggest the world is real and solid. They crash through walls that actually break, they fall from heights that register as genuinely high. They use their surroundings as weapons with an improvisational creativity that echoes Hong Kong action cinema. Bystanders are present and suffer for it, which adds an uncomfortable layer of consequence to what should be purely comic. People are clearly in danger in the background of chicken fights, and nobody comes to help them because the show has no mechanism for acknowledging the damage these two men create in the spaces between their personal war. And yet nothing that happens in these fights is ever addressed in subsequent episodes. The reconstruction costs of a chicken fight, if taken seriously, would bankrupt a small municipality. The show absolutely does not take them seriously. The world simply heals between episodes, the buildings restore themselves, the bystanders are presumably fine, and the next time Peter and Ernie encounter each other, the cycle can begin again. Ernie's son Nugget, introduced in Season 23, represents a generational extension of the feud mythology that the show had never explored before. The episode The Chicken or the Meg used the possibility of a Romeo and Juliet structure within the Griffin-Chicken conflict to give Meg a storyline with genuine stakes and emotional content. A romantic connection that meant something, that required her to make choices, that treated her as the protagonist of her own story rather than the target of someone else's. Meg falling for Nugget, Ernie's response to the relationship, and the ultimatum Ernie delivered were all handled with more care than Meg-focused storylines usually received. Then Meg decapitated Ernie. The showrunners confirmed in interviews published months after the episode that the death was permanent, that Ernie, quote, had gone the way of all flesh. The most persistent antagonist in the show's history, the creature who had survived decapitation, propeller impacts, roasting, and every other apparently lethal thing that Peter had done to him across more than 2 decades of television, was killed by Meg Griffin. There is poetry in who ended it. Peter never could. He won every fight, but the war kept going. Ernie was defined by his ability to survive what Peter did to him, and so Peter could never be the one to deliver a final ending. It was a daughter who finally did what a father could not. The show's most consistently overlooked character proved to be the one capable of closing the longest-running arc in the show's history. In a show full of things that never end, this one ended, and the ending belongs to Meg. Section 9. Meg Griffin, the scapegoat, and what the show chose to do with her. There is a scene in Season 10 where Meg Griffin stands in the living room of her family's home and tells them the truth. Not a cartoon truth, not a joke wrapped in sentiment, but the actual accumulated truth of what they have done to her and what it has cost her. She names specific behaviors. She assigns specific responsibility. She is articulate and correct, and the family, stripped of their usual arrangement, turns on each other. The episode briefly shows what the Griffin household looks like when the stabilizing weight of Meg's suffering is lifted. Then Meg goes back to being the target. She chooses it. She tells Brian that she has decided to accept her role. The family dynamic is restored. The episode ends. The mystery of Meg Griffin is not a cosmological mystery, like Stewie's impossible knowledge, or a physical mystery, like Peter's impossible survival. It is a creative mystery. It is the question of why the people making the show chose to do what they did to a character who started as something ordinary and relatable, and could have remained something ordinary and relatable, or could have been something genuinely interesting, and instead became a vessel for a kind of sustained cruelty that the show occasionally acknowledged was happening but never consistently addressed. Meg's history begins simply. In Season 1, she was voiced by Lacey Chabert, who left the show after the first season due to conflicts with other commitments, including her work on Party of Five and voicing Eliza Thornberry. From Season 2 onward, she was voiced by Mila Kunis, whose casting has been consistent and stable throughout the show's entire subsequent run. Kunis has spoken in interviews about what it meant to her to voice the character, and has also spoken about the real-world impacts of the character's treatment, including the experience of people using the show's catchphrase, dismissal of Meg to real women in her presence. In the first 3 seasons, Meg was the boring one, the unpopular teenager whose ordinariness was played as a contrast to the spectacular dysfunction of the rest of her family. The joke was not that Meg was bad. The joke was that she was insufficiently interesting compared to the people around her. She tried to be normal and cool in a family where normal and cool were irrelevant categories. She wanted things that teenagers want: friends, popularity, a boy who liked her, a family that noticed her. These desires were gently mocked in those early seasons. But gently is the operative word. The mockery was proportionate. The character still registered as a person. What happened between season 3 and the beginning of the revival in season 4 is never fully explained. The writing changed. The jokes about Meg being boring became jokes about Meg being ugly. Then the jokes about Meg being ugly became jokes about Meg being unwanted. Then the jokes about Meg being unwanted became episodes where Peter openly expressed contempt for his daughter's existence, where the family competed to deliver the most cutting dismissal, where Meg was physically harmed in ways the show played for laughs, and where the world of the show seemed to have reached a consensus that Meg Griffin deserved whatever happened to her. The escalation was gradual enough that individual seasons did not always register how far things had moved since the beginning. But looking at the full arc from season 4 to season 14, the trajectory is consistent and deliberate. Each season pushed the treatment a little further. Peter's behavior toward Meg in season 12 or 13 would have been unrecognizable to the season 1 version of the character. The father who was simply inattentive became a father who seemed to actively enjoy making his daughter's life worse. The show has attempted on several occasions to provide a framework for understanding why Peter treats Meg the way he does. The most sustained of these attempts came in the season 14 episode Peter's Sister, which is one of the better episodes the show produced in its later years. The reveal that Peter was himself abused by his sister growing up, and that the cycle of abuse he participates in has its roots in trauma he never processed, gives the Meg storyline a psychological framework that it had been lacking. The reconciliation between Peter and Meg in that episode is genuinely emotional. They reach each other. The barrier between them is briefly dissolved. Then the next episodes reset everything. Peter is back to treating Meg badly. The reconciliation apparently never happened. The framework that could have changed the dynamic was introduced and then abandoned, the way the show abandoned most frameworks that might have required real character development to sustain. What makes Meg's situation strange in its most specific detail is the show's own occasional acknowledgement that it knew what it was doing. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party not only shows Meg confronting her family, but also shows the family in collapse without her to absorb their collective dysfunction. This is the show articulating its own mechanism. It knows Meg is the scapegoat. It knows the scapegoat structure serves a specific social function. It depicts Meg recognizing that function and then choosing to continue performing it. This is either a sophisticated piece of social commentary, or it is the show using the appearance of self-awareness to continue something that self-awareness would normally require you to stop. The reduction of the abuse that reportedly happened from season 14 onward is widely credited in part to the addition of more women to the show's writing staff, who reportedly pushed back against the consistent cruelty toward the series' main teenage girl character. This is a useful data point because it demonstrates something clear. The treatment of Meg was a function of who was in the room, making decisions about her, not a function of anything intrinsic to the character. She could be written differently. She was written differently when the people writing her changed. In those later seasons, Meg began fighting back. She had storylines where her competence was the point. She was shown to be resilient in ways that the earlier post-revival seasons never allowed. The Simpsons crossover gave her a genuine friend in Lisa Simpson and a moment of genuine accomplishment. These episodes proved that the creative potential in the character had always been present. The question was just whether anyone was willing to reach for it. The irony of Meg's arc across the full run of the show is that she may be its most essentially human character. Her desires are the simplest and most recognizable of anyone in the Griffin family. She wants to be loved. She wants to be seen. She wants to belong to people who value her. These are not complicated or unusual things to want. They are the most basic things any person wants from the people they grew up with. The show gave her those desires and then spent 10 seasons penalizing her for having them, framing her need for love as itself something worth mocking. And when the show eventually pulled back from that, the reason it felt like something, the reason the later episodes where Meg was treated with dignity registered as genuine improvement, was because the distance traveled was so great that the arrival anywhere better felt significant. Meg remains, across all the seasons and all the changes, a character whose story is not fully told. She is the clearest window the show has into what it feels like to be the least powerful person in a room full of people who define the terms of your existence. That is not a small thing. That is not a minor supporting role. That is one of the oldest stories in human experience. And in a show that often aimed for something larger and more cosmic, Meg's very human, very grounded, very unresolved story may be the most honest thing the show ever produced. Section 10. The House on Spooner Street and Rooms That Should Not Exist, 31 Spooner Street, Quahog, Rhode Island, zip code 00093. This is the address of the Griffin family home, a two-story yellow clapboard house with white trim, a teal roof, a red front door, a tree in the front yard, a one-car garage, and a backyard where the Providence skyline is sometimes visible. From the exterior, it is a perfectly ordinary-looking suburban New England home of the kind that appears on thousands of residential streets across the region. From the interior, it is one of the most spatially incoherent structures in the history of television architecture, a building that should not be able to contain what it contains, and that rearranges itself between episodes with the casual ease of a place that has decided physics is optional. The inconsistencies in the house's layout are not minor. They are not the kind of small errors that happen when a production team forgets which side of a hallway a door is on. They are substantial and systematic, in ways that suggest the house is not a fixed physical structure, so much as a collection of settings that are arranged and rearranged, depending on what each episode needs at each moment. Begin with the most obvious problem. From the exterior, the house is clearly a two-story structure with a specific and limited footprint. The kind of house you might realistically find in a working-class Rhode Island suburb, perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 square feet, 4 bedrooms being a tight fit at that size, with 1 or maybe 1.5 bathrooms. This is a modest house by any standard. And yet the show has depicted this house as containing a full basement that sometimes appears and sometimes does not, an attic that is sometimes accessible and sometimes sealed, a man cave that has been located in the attic, in the basement, and in various intermediate positions, a piano room or study that appears on the first floor in some episodes and does not in others, and at least one episode where a secret room was accessed through a bookcase that was never referenced again before or after. The staircase leading to the second floor changes in ways that are measurable if you look carefully. The number of steps varies between episodes. The position of the staircase relative to the living room entrance shifts. The landing at the top of the stairs occupies different positions depending on which character needs to be visible from which angle at which moment. The bedrooms off the upstairs hallway have their doors in different positions relative to each other and to the staircase. Stewie's nursery is sometimes immediately adjacent to the master bedroom and sometimes at the opposite end of a hallway that would not fit within the exterior footprint of the house. Peter's man cave, the space he retreats to when family life becomes too much, is the single most dramatically inconsistent space in the house. It has been in the attic when attic access served the episode's plot. It has been in the basement when basement humor was called for. It has been in an intermediate space accessed through a trapdoor, when trapdoor comedy was the goal. Its contents shift between appearances. Sometimes a full bar with stools, sometimes just a mini fridge, sometimes a pool table, sometimes not. Sometimes sports memorabilia and comfortable furniture, sometimes a more utilitarian collection of boxes and tools. The space responds to what the joke needs rather than to any consistent architectural reality. The living room is the most stable space in the house, which makes sense given how much screen time it receives. It is anchored by the green couch facing the television, with a coffee table, armchairs, family photos on the walls, and sometimes a piano in the corner. The carpet color changed between the original run and the revival. Yellow in seasons 1 through 3, green from season 4 onward. This color change has been maintained consistently, which makes it one of the few architectural details the show actually tracked across time. The kitchen sits adjacent to the living room and is recognizable by its yellow walls, though the exact arrangement of the appliances and dining area within it has shifted between episodes in ways that would give an architectural draftsman a headache. The house has a previous owner. The Griffin family purchased the home, according to the episode A Mission Impossible, after Peter received a financial settlement involving a broken condom that also resulted in Chris's conception. A ghost named Doris Billingsley, referenced in another episode as having died in the house in March of 1962, suggests the house has a history predating the Griffins by at least several decades. Mrs. Billingsley's presence as a ghost at the house further complicates the structure's reality. It is not just a shifting architectural space, but a place with its own history of residents and events that the show only occasionally acknowledges. The house's address, 31 Spooner Street, was named by Seth MacFarlane after Spooner Hill Road in Cumberland, Rhode Island, near the area where he grew up. The real-world address of 31 Spooner Street in Providence sits immediately west of Roger Williams Park. Some fans have visited this address and noted that the house there looks nothing like the Griffin home, that the neighborhood around it is recognizably Providence, but does not match the visual atmosphere of Spooner Street in the show. The address is a tribute, not a blueprint. One of the most canonically interesting moments in the house's history comes from E. Peterbus Unum. In this episode, Peter discovers that due to a surveying error, his house is technically not part of Quahog. It is not part of any Rhode Island municipality. It is not in any county. It is not even part of the United States. The Griffin House is a sovereign territory, a patch of land that exists within the geography of Rhode Island, but outside the legal jurisdiction of any governmental entity. Peter formally declares independence and names his new nation Pretoria, originally intending to call it Peterland, before discovering that a local establishment had already taken that name. The episode uses this premise entirely for comedy, but within the show's logic, it establishes something real. The Griffin home occupies an anomalous position in the legal and geographic fabric of the surrounding area. It appeared on no maps of Quahog before Peter's discovery. Its status was undefined. It existed in a gap between official categories. This is an almost perfect metaphor for what the house is in the show more broadly. It exists outside the normal categories. It occupies a space that the surrounding world's logic does not fully account for. It contains more than its exterior would suggest and responds to internal logic rather than external constraint. In a town that itself exists in geographic ambiguity, the Griffin House is the most ambiguous point in the most ambiguous place. The house is, in a way, the whole show in miniature, bigger on the inside than it looks from the outside, rearranging itself to serve the moment, accumulating history without always keeping track of it, and remaining somehow perfectly recognizable, no matter how many impossible things have happened inside it. Section 11. The minor characters and their unexplained depths. Family Guy has accumulated a supporting cast across its run that numbers in the dozens of recurring characters, and some of the most genuinely mysterious figures in the show are not the main family at all. They are the characters who orbit the Griffins, appearing episode after episode with consistent personalities, but without any full explanation of who they are, where they came from, or why they are the way they are. Begin with Herbert. His first name is John, a detail revealed in the Valentine's Day episode. He lives down the street from the Griffins. He walks with a walker that suggests significant age and limited mobility. He speaks in a soft, high-pitched, slightly whistling voice that carries the specific quality of old age's quieter register. He has a dog named Jesse who is also very old and uses a mobility cart for his back legs. Together, Herbert and Jesse present a portrait of extended old age in which two beings are helping each other through a world that has largely moved past them. Herbert's interest in teenage boys, specifically Chris Griffin, is not a subtext. It is explicit, acknowledged by the show on multiple occasions, including a scene in the episode Play It Again, Brian, where Chris finally asks him directly whether he is a pedophile, though the scene cuts away without an on-screen answer. Stewie, in the episode Spies Reminiscent of Us, explicitly refers to a pedophile who lives down the street about whom nobody is doing anything because he is so funny. The show acknowledges the nature of Herbert's interest while simultaneously treating him as a beloved recurring character. This is a tension the show has never resolved and probably could not resolve without fundamentally changing what Herbert is. What complicates Herbert beyond the single defining trait is the backstory the show gave him in a World War II episode. Young Herbert is depicted as a soldier in love with another young man named Billy who died in battle. Herbert has been carrying that love, unspoken and unresolved, for decades. He is old not just because the show needs an old character, but because he has been old for a very long time, keeping company with grief for a person the world would not have let him grieve publicly. This backstory does not excuse anything about his behavior toward Chris, but it places his loneliness in a context that makes him more than his worst quality. He is a man who loved someone, lost them in a war, and has been alone since. The particular shape that loneliness took over the decades is what the show depicts. Quagmire occupies a different kind of mystery. Glenn Quagmire is 61 years old, a detail revealed in a later season episode, and has been the Griffin family's neighbor and Peter's close friend since the very beginning of the show. His sexual appetite is so central to how the show uses him that it has largely crowded out other aspects of his character, and yet those other aspects are present if you look for them. He is a skilled commercial pilot with a career that requires competence, discipline, and reliability. His loyalty to the friend group has been demonstrated repeatedly. In the episode Jerome is the New Black, he delivers to Brian the most precisely observed character critique in the show's history, a speech that identifies every flaw in Brian's self-presentation and does so not with cruelty but with the clarity of someone who has been paying attention for a long time. The speed and specificity with which Quagmire articulates Brian's failures suggests that this assessment had been forming for years. He had simply been waiting for an occasion to share it. Joe Swanson's trajectory across the show's run is one of its sadder character histories. He was introduced in Season 1 as the cool, capable, admired new neighbor, someone who inspired genuine jealousy in Peter because of how impressive he was despite his disability. Joe was tough, skilled, respected, and genuinely formidable. Over the seasons, the show gradually shifted that dynamic. His disability became a source of humor increasingly rather than character. His friendships became more contentious. The man who Peter was once jealous of became someone Peter could condescend to, and the show treated this reversal as natural rather than as loss. In his best episodes, Joe is a character who knows what has happened to his social standing and carries that knowledge with dignity rather than bitterness, which makes him more interesting than many of the show's more colorful personalities. Mort Goldman exists in the show's universe as the nervous, hypochondriacal, financially anxious Jewish pharmacist, and the show has been inconsistent in how far it pushes that characterization toward caricature. The death of his wife Muriel affected him in ways the show tracked with unusual consistency, making his grief a permanent feature of his characterization rather than a one-episode event. Brian's son Dylan, who appeared in several episodes in Season 5 and then effectively vanished, represents one of the show's more specifically unresolved supporting character mysteries. Dylan was introduced as Brian's estranged biological son, a child he had never properly parented, who arrived at the Griffin house already angry and already certain that his father did not care about him. The episode The Former Life of Brian gave Dylan and Brian a genuine arc. Brian learning to be a father, Dylan learning to trust a parent who had failed him. The resolution was earned. Then the show mostly stopped using Dylan. He is out there, in the show's universe, Brian's son, someone for whom Brian is now theoretically responsible. The show simply chose not to keep exploring that, which is its own kind of answer about what the show values. The minor character of Death, who has appeared in supporting roles across multiple episodes, is worth one more mention here for what his presence tells us about the show's cosmological architecture. Death as a neighbor character, as a figure who shows up and does his job and occasionally interacts with the Griffins in contexts that are not his professional visits, suggests something about the kind of universe Quahog is. The world is not divided into the living and the dead. It is divided into those who Death has visited and those he has not yet gotten around to, and the difference is administrative rather than absolute. Everything is more available in Quahog than it should be. Death is more accessible. The past is more accessible. Other universes are more accessible. The rules are more flexible. And the result is a world that sometimes feels like it is held together by collective agreement more than by physics. A place where everyone has quietly decided to accept that this is how things are here, and where that acceptance allows the impossible to happen every week without anyone ever remarking on it. Section 12. The meta layer and whether Family Guy knows what it is. The final and deepest mystery of Family Guy is whether the show knows it is a show. This is not as abstract as it sounds. Over 26 seasons, the show has broken the fourth wall often enough, and in enough sustained and self-consistent ways, that it has constructed a genuine metafictional layer that sits beneath the regular narrative like a second foundation. The most explicit exploration of this layer comes in the episode Inside Family Guy, which presents itself as a behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the show. In this episode, the Griffin family members are not characters living their lives. They are actors, performing versions of themselves for a television show. The episode depicts the recording process, the relationship between the performers and the production, and the gap between who these characters are in their scripted scenes and who they are when the cameras are not rolling. Seth MacFarlane appears in the episode as himself, interacting with characters who are his own creations, and the characters acknowledge this relationship directly. Peter knows he was created by Seth MacFarlane. He knows he is on television. He knows the show is called Family Guy. This is as direct a statement of meta-awareness as any television show has produced within its own fiction, and it retroactively changes how you can read every other episode. If the characters know they are characters, if they know someone created them and someone is watching, then every episode they have ever appeared in has this potential layer of self-awareness underneath it. They might always have known. The question is whether they were choosing not to acknowledge it, or whether the knowledge was only present in the episodes where the show decided to access it. The episode Back to the Pilot adds another layer. When Brian and Stewie travel back to the first episode of the show in 1999, they are not just time traveling in the show's internal chronology. They are visiting the show's own history as an artifact. When they comment on the animation quality of the 1999 episode, noting that it looks different from the current show, they are doing something that characters and stories do not normally do. They are recognizing that they exist in a different rendering of their own world, and that the difference reflects a change in production quality over time rather than any change within the world they inhabit. This is the show watching itself. It requires a kind of awareness of the show as an external object that exists in the world, as a product that was made and has a history, rather than as a reality the characters simply live in. Then, there is the American Dad connection. In a Season 6 episode of American Dad, the CIA agent Stan Smith reveals his top 10 favorite fictional dogs, and at number 1 he places Brian Griffin. This establishes something specific. In the American Dad universe, Brian Griffin is a fictional character. Family Guy is a television show within American Dad's world. The Griffins are not real people in Stan Smith's universe. They are the characters from a show he has watched. But American Dad and Family Guy are confirmed to exist in the same universe. Brian has appeared in an American Dad episode as a real character, sitting outside a courthouse sipping a martini and claiming that Stan was the fictional one. The episode played this as a comedic standoff between two characters, each claiming the other does not really exist, both clearly existing in the same scene. The paradox was not resolved, because it is funnier unresolved. But the paradox is real. Brian is simultaneously a real dog in the Family Guy universe and a fictional dog in the American Dad universe, and both of these things are true in the same shared universe. The most philosophically complete version of the meta-mystery comes from combining several pieces. Stewie caused the Big Bang. The Big Bang created the universe. The universe created Stewie. The universe in which Stewie exists is the Family Guy universe, which is also a fictional television show within the American Dad universe, which is produced by the real person Seth MacFarlane, with whom the fictional characters have met and conversed. What this chain of relations creates is a closed loop of self-reference that has no stable outside. The show is creating the character who is creating the universe that the show exists in. The creator is part of the creation. The creation is watching the creator. Everything contains everything else, and none of it has a verifiable outside edge. There is a fan theory, widely shared and discussed, that the entire show takes place within Stewie's perception. The strange, elastic, consequence-free quality of Family Guy's world is, under this theory, explained by the fact that the world is being perceived and processed by a 1-year-old baby with a genius intelligence and an unusual relationship with reality. The cutaway gags are Stewie's associative mind making unexpected connections. The violence that never has permanent consequences reflects an infant's understanding of cause and effect, which is still developing. The reset button quality of the world, where everything is always roughly the same from episode to episode, reflects the limited continuity awareness of a very young child who is still learning that the world persists when you are not looking at it. This theory does not hold up across all episodes, and it was never intended as official canon, but it captures something true about the show's texture. The world of Family Guy feels like a dream world, or a child's world. Vivid, funny, occasionally cruel, subject to sudden reversals, populated by people who are simultaneously familiar and strange, and governed by rules that feel consistent until you look at them directly. What does it mean that the show has spent 26 seasons building this complicated, self-referential, internally inconsistent, perpetually elastic universe? Perhaps nothing except that the people making it were always more interested in the joke than in the architecture. The mysteries are not there because the show wanted to create mystery. They are there because the show was made by many different writers over many years, because the primary goal was always the laugh rather than the logic, and because a world built for comedy rather than for coherence will naturally accumulate questions that nobody planned to answer. But the accumulation matters. Every unanswered question about Peter's physics, Brian's origin, Stewie's knowledge, the town's geography, the Griffin house's impossible rooms, the eternal war with Ernie the chicken, the meaning of the multiverse, the show's self-awareness, all of these add up to something. Not to a solved puzzle, but to the feeling of a world that has more in it than you can see at any one time. The feeling that if you watched closely enough, for long enough, in the right state of relaxed attention, something would reveal itself. That feeling is the real mystery of Family Guy. Not any single unanswered question, but the totality of questions, the way they all point towards something the show never quite names. A sense that underneath the cutaway gags and the shock value and the recycled premises and the inconsistent continuity, there is a world that genuinely existed, in its way, for a long time. A world with its own weather and its own gravity and its own logic, however elastic, and its own small cast of people who were trying, in their various ways, to get through the days. Peter, who should not be alive, going home anyway to the house that should not hold together, to the family he has improbably maintained across decades of impossible situations. Brian, who should not be a person, paying his bills and nursing his martini, and wondering when his novel will finally be finished. Stewie, who should not be possible, sitting in his nursery surrounded by weapons he built himself, carrying the universe inside him and not yet knowing what to do with it. Meg, who should have left and has not, standing in the kitchen with the yellow walls, trying to remember what it was she wanted. And the town around them, the town that cannot be found on any map, full of people who are either too big or too small or too strange or too ordinary, existing in a geography that does not correspond to any real place, held together by the collective agreement that this is where the story happens, and that the story is worth showing up for. It is late now, wherever you are. The mystery is not solved, and it will not be, but perhaps that is exactly right. Some questions are better lived with than answered, and the world of this strange, improbable, occasionally brilliant, endlessly strange show is one of them. Thank you for staying this long. Thank you for watching, for listening, for letting this wash over you in the dark. If this was the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing takes a moment, and it means a great deal. Leave a comment if there is a particular mystery we did not get to tonight that you would like to explore next time. The questions are endless. The night is long. And somewhere in a house on Spooner Street in a town that does not appear on any map, the light is still on. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep exploration. See you next time. Extra depth. The show's relationship with Rhode Island as a real place. The decision to set Family Guy in Rhode Island rather than a deliberately generic American city was one of the foundational creative choices that gave the show its particular atmosphere. Most American animated comedies choose settings that are either explicitly real major cities, like Springfield and The Simpsons being a deliberate composite of small-town America assembled from various real places, or entirely fictional locations designed to carry no regional specificity at all. Family Guy chose something in between, a fictional town embedded in a real and specific state, with real landmarks visible in the background and real geography providing the bones of the fictional world built on top of it. Rhode Island as a state has a quality that makes it an unusually good home for a show about dysfunction. It is the smallest state in the country by area, a fact that generates its own particular psychology among longtime residents. People from Rhode Island have a very specific relationship with their state's smallness, a combination of genuine affection and exasperated self-awareness that produces a culture of in-jokes and references that outsiders never quite understand. The state has a disproportionately large number of organized crime connections in its history for its size. Providence, in particular, went through a period of spectacularly colorful political corruption in the 1990s under Mayor Buddy Cianci, who was convicted of conspiracy charges related to a city hall bribery scheme, served time, was released, and was then re-elected to the mayorship before being convicted again. This is not a background fact. It is the active, ongoing story of the city during the years when Family Guy was being developed and first aired. A town that elected its mayor twice despite felony convictions is a town with a specific attitude toward the gap between how things are supposed to work and how they actually do. MacFarlane has said in interviews that growing up in New England gave him a sensibility about a particular kind of working-class life that he wanted the show to explore. A life where the aspirations were real and the obstacles were specific, and the humor came from the collision between what people wanted and what the world was willing to give them. The Rhode Island setting was the geographic form of that sensibility. It placed the Griffins in a world with actual history, actual culture, actual institutions, and an actual economic reality that made their particular version of struggling to manage family life feel grounded rather than arbitrary. The accents in the show are worth noting. Rhode Island has one of the most distinctive regional accents in American English, a sound that sits somewhere between Boston and New York, with its own specific vowel patterns and dropped consonants. The Providence accent drops the R at the end of syllables in the Boston manner, but has a different rhythm and a different set of vowel sounds that mark it as distinctly Rhode Island rather than Massachusetts. The show uses this accent inconsistently. Peter has something approaching a vague New England sound that becomes more pronounced when the episode specifically calls attention to it, but fades into generic American animation voice work in most scenes. Brian has no regional accent whatsoever. Lois has a sound that is closer to Connecticut or upstate New York than Rhode Island, which makes sense given her background as a wealthy woman whose parents would have sent her to schools where regional accents were coached out. The inconsistency in how the show handles accent is not really inconsistency. It is the show making different choices about how much regional specificity to apply to different characters based on their class background and education level. The Providence that appears in the background of the show, in the 3 buildings of the skyline visible from the Griffin backyard, was in the middle of one of the most dramatic physical transformations of any American city when Family Guy began airing. Providence spent most of the 20th century in economic decline following the collapse of the textile industry that had been its primary economic engine for over a century. By the 1990s, the city had begun a major revitalization effort centered on uncovering the rivers that had been paved over decades earlier to create parking lots, restoring the historic downtown architecture, and repositioning the city as a cultural destination rather than a post-industrial remnant. The transformation was visible and ongoing throughout the years, when the show was developing and establishing itself. The show never directly engages with this transformation. Providence revitalization does not appear as a story element. The skyline in the background is the skyline as it was when the show began, fixed in time in the way that the show's geography is generally fixed to whatever version of Quahog was established in the early seasons. But the presence of that skyline, across every season and every backyard scene, is a quiet acknowledgement that the show knows where it is. Not in a way that requires accuracy or consistency, but in a way that keeps a thread of connection to a real place alive across a very long time. Extra depth. The role of music in the show's strangest moments. Family Guy has always used music in ways that are more ambitious than most animated comedies bother to attempt. From the original run forward, the show included original songs and musical sequences that were produced with genuine craft, not just as comedy filler but as pieces that worked musically in their own right. The song You've Got a Lot to See, performed in the episode Brian in Love, is a genuine piece of vocal performance craft built around a jazz-influenced structure. The show's willingness to let musical sequences run to their natural length rather than cutting them for time created space for actual musical ideas to develop. The show's most repeated musical gag, the Conway Twitty sequences that appeared multiple times across several seasons, is interesting precisely because it is the most aggressive version of the show's approach to music as comedy. Conway Twitty was a country music singer who died in 1993, and his music has a specific sound connected to a specific era of American country. Smooth, professionally produced, emotionally sincere in a way that country music of that period specialized in. The joke of cutting to a full Conway Twitty performance in the middle of a Family Guy episode operates on several levels simultaneously. The first level is simple subversion. You are watching one kind of show, and the show suddenly becomes a different kind of show, a country music performance video, without explanation or transition. The second level is duration. The performance is not a brief clip. It is the full song, played out in full, past the point where the surprise wears off, past the point where the novelty alone could sustain it, into a territory where the humor exists entirely in the show's refusal to end the joke at a conventional time. The third level, which not all viewers reach, is the quality of the music itself. Conway Twitty was genuinely good at what he did, and the songs used are not bad songs. They are songs that work on their own terms, which creates a strange double experience of being made to wait by a joke while also hearing something that is, if you lean into it, actually pleasant to listen to. The show's original musical productions for special episodes like A Family Guy Freakin' Christmas and Road to the North Pole demonstrate a different level of musical ambition. These episodes include original songs with multiple voices, harmonies, counter melodies, and production values that would not be out of place in an actual theatrical release. The cast of the show, particularly Seth MacFarlane, whose background includes extensive work as a singer and musical performer, brings genuine vocal skill to these sequences. The comedy musical tradition in which these episodes participate is one that requires the music to actually work as music, rather than simply being close enough to music to function as a joke delivery system. The original theme song, composed by Walter Murphy, is itself a small masterpiece of efficient television composition. It introduces the full family and their dynamic, moves through a clear narrative arc, establishes the show's tonal relationship between warmth and chaos, and concludes in a way that sends you into the episode with the right emotional and rhythmic orientation. Murphy is a composer with legitimate classical training who created music for films and television throughout his career, and the theme song benefits from that background. It is one of the most recognizable pieces of original music in American animated television history, and its recognizability comes from musical quality rather than simple repetition. Closer. Returning to the night and what remains. We have spent a long time tonight in a world that does not hold still, a town that cannot be located, a house that cannot be mapped, a man who cannot be killed, a dog who cannot be categorized, a baby who cannot be explained, a teenage girl who deserved better than she got, a recurring chicken who might be immortal. A universe that has been folding back on itself for 26 years and shows no signs of stopping. What I hope carries with you, as the video ends and you move toward wherever the night takes you next, is not the resolution of any of these mysteries. There are no resolutions. That is the point. The world of Family Guy is a place that generates questions and sits comfortably inside the questions, rather than feeling the need to answer them. The characters live in perpetual uncertainty about what they are, where they are, whether any of it matters, and they mostly do just fine. They keep showing up at the Drunken Clam. They keep arguing around the kitchen table. The house keeps failing to make architectural sense, and the family keeps living inside it anyway. That is something, actually. That is a kind of wisdom in its own register, not the grand kind that comes from resolved narratives and earned conclusions, but the daily kind that comes from continuing to show up in a world that never fully explains itself. The world outside your window tonight is also full of questions without resolutions, things that do not add up, systems that do not fully make sense, people whose behavior resists simple explanation. The difference between that world and Quahog is smaller than it first appears. The mystery is the thing, the wondering is the point. The late night and the low light and the slow voice talking through impossible things is its own answer to the question of what you need at the end of a day, which is usually just something that says, "Here, come in, sit down, the strangeness is fine, we are all in it together." And there is no particular urgency about figuring any of it out tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the time you spent in this with me tonight. If you want more of this, if this is the kind of exploration you want to find when you come looking for something to fall asleep to, subscribing is the thing that makes more of it possible, and it genuinely matters. Leave a comment with whatever thought is still sitting with you. I read them. I think about them. They go into what gets made next. Sleep well. The mysteries will still be there in the morning. Extra depth. The animation studios and how they shaped the world. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of Family Guy's visual history is the way that different animation studios, working on the show at different points in its run, gave the world of Quahog genuinely different physical textures. The characters looked and moved differently depending on which studio was handling the work, and those differences were not just aesthetic. They affected how jokes landed, how physical comedy registered, and how the world of the show felt to inhabit as a viewer. The earliest seasons, specifically the original run from 1999 to 2002, had a quality that fans consistently describe as alive and handmade. The character outlines were variable. The movement had an energy that came from the irregular quality of traditional hand-drawn animation. Characters did not always move in perfectly smooth arcs. Their expressions had a range and spontaneity that came from the specific choices of individual animators rather than the averaged-out consistency that later, more digitally refined production would produce. Rough Draft Studios handled significant portions of the second and third seasons, and their work has a quality that many long-term fans cite as the gold standard for how the show should look and move. When the show returned from its cancellation for Season 4, the animation shifted toward a cleaner, more digitally finished look. The outlines became thicker and more consistent. The character movements became smoother and more constrained. The show looked more polished than it ever had, and for many fans, it also looked less like itself. The scrappy energy of the original run gave way to something more professional and less distinctive. Later seasons saw further shifts as different studios took over different production blocks. Digital Emation, a Korean animation studio, handled portions of later seasons and brought yet another visual sensibility, one that was technically competent, but that gave the characters a slightly different proportion and movement quality that longtime viewers registered as an unfamiliar texture, even if they could not always name why. What these changing animation styles did to the mysteries of the show was subtle but real. A world that looks slightly different from season to season is a world that reinforces its own elastic quality, its refusal to hold a fixed visual identity even when the characters and locations are nominally the same. The house changes its rooms between episodes in the script. The house also changes its visual texture between seasons in the animation. Both kinds of change contribute to the same fundamental quality. A world that is constantly slightly different from how you remember it being, that never quite settles into a fixed form you can memorize completely, that keeps generating small surprises even after decades of familiarity. This visual instability is, in a strange way, one of the show's most honest qualities. The world of Family Guy is not a fixed place. It is a place that exists in a different form every time you visit it, assembled freshly from the materials available to the people making it at that specific moment. The animation style changes are not continuity errors. They are the world showing you, honestly, that it is made, that it has a production history, that the people who built it changed and so did what they built. In a show that has been remarkably willing to be self-aware about its own nature, the changing animation is the most literal version of that self-awareness. The visible fingerprints of time on a world that is otherwise trying to pretend it exists in eternal present. Extra depth. The Pawtucket Patriot and the economy of the Griffin world. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Brewery, and the existence of this employer is one of the most quietly interesting fixtures in the show's world. A regional craft brewery of the scale the show depicts, producing enough volume to be widely available across New England while employing enough people to maintain the factory floor scenes the show occasionally depicts, represents a specific kind of post-industrial New England economy that has real analogs in the region. Rhode Island and Massachusetts have both seen significant growth in craft brewing as part of a broader economic repositioning away from the manufacturing industries that defined the region through most of the 20th century. The Pawtucket Patriot sits at the intersection of working-class employment and the new craft beverage economy. Peter's job at the brewery has been inconsistent in its description of what he actually does there. He has been described as a shipping clerk, as a safety inspector, and in other episodes seems to have duties that cross different departments without clear explanation. The job has been sufficient to maintain the Griffin family's lifestyle, which is itself a minor economic mystery. a house of the Griffin family's size in a Rhode Island coastal community, maintained by a single income from a non-supervisory brewery job, supporting a family of 5, including a wife and 3 children, without apparent financial stress in most episodes. The economics are not realistic by any careful standard, but they are not meant to be. They are meant to be sufficient to establish that the Griffins are a working-class family without the financial stress that would make their adventures impossible. The Pawtucket Patriot Ale itself, as a product, has its own cameo appearances in the show's universe. The can design is consistent and recognizable. It appears on shelves and in refrigerators across different episodes in ways that establish it as a real product within the fictional economy of Quahog. The show has also used the brewery as a location for episodes involving workplace dynamics, union disputes, and the specific social world of industrial employment, giving it an identity beyond simply being where Peter goes during the workday. It is a place with its own hierarchy, its own politics, its own texture, which in a show that rarely develops non-domestic locations in detail is notable. The brewery's name combines Pawtucket, a real Rhode Island city with genuine historical significance as the birthplace of American industrialization, with patriot, a word that sits at the intersection of New England's civic identity and American nationalism more broadly. The combination is both regionally specific and broadly accessible, a fictional brand that could plausibly exist in the real world while being clearly of the fictional one. Like the show itself, it is grounded enough to feel real without being real enough to require accuracy. The question of where exactly Peter fits in the brewery's organizational chart has never been fully resolved by the show, and that unresolved status is itself a kind of truth about a certain kind of working life. Many people spend years in jobs where their exact role is understood by practice rather than by job title, where what they do each day is clear, but what their position is called is a secondary concern. Peter's job at the Pawtucket Patriot is like that. Real enough to fill a workday, vague enough that the show can put him where any given episode needs him to be. It is working-class life distilled to its most essential narrative element, which is not the job itself but the fact of having one, the rhythm of departure and return, the way employment structures time even when the work itself is mostly invisible to the story being told.